my wife. It's not until next 3 o'clock.
She mentioned the short.
That's my first and last. I don't know why people go out.
I know what my couple got kids, and of course my daughter's playing.
See where your kids are, where the ball goes. You watch on TV, you're listening to
JV football game.
I don't like football.
You were probably the last person I knew that I'd see somebody.
Well, you won't see me again, so. I told Brad I'll take him out every week for dinner and send him those games.
No, that's Rob's. It's not Rob and Kelly.
It's 3 o'clock and time for our September 19th joint meeting of the Indian River County Board of County Commission, the mayors of Indian River County, and the Beach and Shore Commission. I'd like us to begin, please, by rising and joining me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Before getting to the substance of the meeting, I'd like to first make an announcement and then ask the group to give me a hand in a photo opportunity. I'm going to ask Commissioner O'Brien to make the announcement.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some of you all know that last week was the annual Beach and Shore Preservation Conference down in Miami, I believe it was. And at that meeting, Ralph Sexton, one of the early proponents of preserving our beaches and on the committee also, was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award down there at that meeting. So I know Ralph isn't here today, but I just would like everybody to know that he was recognized with that honor, and we're proud that it was given to Ralph, and just want to let everybody know that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And the United Way is here today, and they wanted to take a picture of some community leaders, and for some reason they picked us. So I'm going to ask if the county commissioners and all the mayors to just come up to the front if they'd allow their picture to be taken by the United Way.
You know, I've had a number.
Yeah, I know that. Wesley, you did know that.
It's all right. Stay with, I'm going to go ahead and autograph this picture in advance.
We're going to have Susan in the middle.
We'll never do that
Between all the thorns.
Yeah, just get James to make the turn this off. Right up.
Turn it off.
Done.
How you doing, guys?
Oh, wait. You're going to be a fringe guy?
I'm not a fringe official.
Yeah, but you're the reason what happened is picture taken.
Interesting part, if you weren't here, then we wouldn't have it.
Is that screen going to throw
I
everything off?
need just a little squished in.
Watch out.
Just one more.
Ow, my toe, Gary.
Okay. And just a little bit back. There.
Gary.
You want me to turn that off?
Okay. And ready? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
That's the
And now, if we could, we'll just go around the table and let everybody introduce themselves. I begin with Commissioner O'Brien.
Peter O'Brien, Board of County Commissioners, and the liaison to the Beach and Shore Committee.
Alan Flackwood, County Attorney.
Jerry Wheeler, Indian River County Commission.
That's Wesley Davis, Indian River County Commission.
Joe Fletcher, Indian River County Commission.
Jerry White, Vice Mayor of Indian River Shores, alternate on the Beach and Shores Committee.
David Barney, Beach and Shores.
Cheryl Gerstner, Beaches and Shores Committee.
Rob Lindsay, Beaches and Shores appointee also.
Bill Troxel, Town of Orchid, representative on the Beach and Shore Committee.
Susan Adams, Mayor of the City of Ellesmere.
Tom Gadden, Mayor of Indian River Shores.
Don Wright, Vice Mayor Sebastian.
Jay Kramer, Mayor of Vero Beach.
Richard Dunlop, Mayor of Orchid.
Leona Allen, Clerk to the Board of County Commissioners.
Gary Zurillo, Florida Tech.
Mike Walter with Coastal Tech.
James Gray, Indian River County Coastal Engineer.
Thank you. And now I'll ask Chris Moore if there's anybody else from the staff you'd like to introduce.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce James Gray, our coastal engineer, who will be speaking today. along with Mr. Michael Walther of Coastal Tech and Dr. Gary Zarillo. He'll also be speaking today. What they're going to do is basically go over some of the alternatives in coastal structures. I think here in the county we've got a history of using sand replenishment, sand renourishment on our beach projects. In our original Sector 7 project in the South County, Sectors 1 and 2 in the North County, and the current project is Sector 3. These gentlemen will be talking about alternatives to that process of bringing in sand. There's been many structures that have been used over the years in other counties and in other places in the country and in the world, really, with some mixed results depending on the type of structure. So the reason we're all here today is to get some idea, is there alternative, are there alternatives to just bringing in sand? What kind of success, if any, that those projects have had? And I think we're going to start out with James. We'll be going over our some of the other projects that we've done in the county as well as our beach preservation. James.
Thank you, Chris. Let me just start off. Can we dim the lights? Is that possible? Or I wanted to start out with the purpose of the workshop, and it's to explore the potential of sand retention structures in conjunction with the overall objectives of the Indian River County Beach Preservation Plan. Now I'll go into some of the highlights of our beach preservation plan, but I wanted to note these two bullets are actually from Beach Nourishment and Protection publication, and it states that no device, conventional or unconventional, creates sand in the surf zone. Any accumulation of sand produced by a structure is that at the expense of an adjacent section of the shore. Also, beach nourishment stands in contrast as the only engineered shore protection alternative that directly addresses the problematic sand budget deficit, because it is the process of adding sand from sources outside the eroding system. So essentially, sand retention structures, they retain the sand. Beach nourishment adds sand to the system. So I just wanted to present that to everybody. Some of the goals and objectives.
Use the microphone.
Sorry. Can everybody hear me? Is that on? Okay. Some of the goals and objectives of the workshop I'd like to strive for is provide a general understanding of the use of coastal structures and the science behind them. Also, identify the various types of shoreline modeling that's used to evaluate coastal structure design. And finally, to seek guidance on how to proceed with this program. For example, maybe forming a technical advisory committee to explore the use of these structures and so forth. So hopefully we'll with discussion of this workshop, we'll come up with some guidance. As far as the presentation outline, I'll be giving a brief update of our beach preservation plan and some of the history of our current and past projects, some of the more shoreline armoring structures that we have within the county. Mr. Mike Walther will be presenting different types of coastal structures used throughout the state of Florida. These are groins, breakwater systems, and so forth. And Dr. Gary Zarillo will be presenting some of the different shoreline modeling techniques that are used when evaluating these structures. And Mr. Jason Brown will be updating on some of the funding for our beach preservation plan. Beach preservation plan is a comprehensive plan that identifies specific management strategies to address the erosion along our county shoreline. It was originally developed and adopted 1988, updated in 1998, and again updated in 2008. So we're on a 10-year cycle of updates. So we're pretty much right around the corner for a new update and so forth. The BPP divides the county shoreline, 22.5 miles of shoreline, into 8 planning sectors, recommends implementation strategies, and also identifies funding sources. This slide I included because it's important. It not only breaks down the county into the 8 sectors, however, also the sectors are set up in a way that they follow the this laser's not working, but follows the critically eroded areas designated by the state. And that's an important distinction because typically the state agencies will not issue permits outside of these critically eroded areas. So in the northern part of the county, we have 9.5 miles of critically eroded beach. That includes sectors 1, 2, and 3. Indian River Shores is actually not designated as a critically eroded area. City of Vero Beach, our Sector 5 section, critically eroded. South Beach area, not critically eroded. And finally, the remaining 3.1 miles of the shoreline, Sector 7, part of 8, South County is designated critically eroded. So in total, 15.7 of the 22.4 miles, or 70% of the county, is designated critically eroded. Some of the strategies that were presented in our beach preservation plan, the last update, were to not do anything, no action, maintain a natural beach zone policy, so no planned sand placement activities and so forth. Large-scale placement of material via the Sebastian Inlet District. The Sebastian Inlet District is actually maintaining our sectors 1 and 2 project area with their dredging of their sand trap and also truck haul projects and so forth. We also have dune maintenance zones, which are small-scale projects, mainly upland projects, placing sand in these problematic hot spots or critically eroded areas. And dune maintenance zones, just placing material along the dunes. And finally, we also have beach restoration zones, which are large-scale beach projects such as Sector 3, where we place offshore and upland sources, offshore or upland sources along the beach. Just a quick summary of our Sectors 1 and 2 project area. It was originally constructed in 2003. It's 2.5 miles of beach in the northern part of the county. It was constructed originally with 586,000 yards, then renourished after the hurricanes in 2004 and 2007 with another 250,000 yards of material. Sector 7, this was our second project that the county took. It's in South County, the project, south part of the county. It's 2 miles of beach. These are some before and after photos just showing what the constructed before and after look, or during, after, and this is use of offshore structures as well as the Sectors 1 and 2 area. And finally, our current project that we're working on is our Sector 2 project. It's 6.5 miles of beach within the Wabasso Beach segment area, or our Sector 3 section. This is using upland sand sources as a sand source. I put this slide in here just to show you over the last several years, decades, how much fill upland or offshore has been placed. Also, Sebastian Inlet District has placed on the beach. In total, among the sectors 1 through 8, we've placed approximately 3.3 million yards of material on the 22.4 miles of the beach. And this is from a time period of 1978 to 2011. I just wanted to briefly go over the coastal structures that we actually have in the county right now. More shoreline armoring structures, but I did want to show you that there are structures that the county does have. We have a jetty system. Mike Walter is going to be going into more about that and so forth, but the main purpose of a jetty is to stabilize an inlet for navigational purposes and so forth. Northern part of our county, we have Sebastian Inlet. We also have a rock revetment, or more of a shoreline armoring feature. This is the rock revetment. It's more of a seawall type structure, protecting, in this case, McClarty Museum. This is right after our Sectors 1 and 2 beach nourishment project. So you can see there's a wide beach in front of it. But prior to that, there was a last-ditch effort to try to save that crosswalk and so forth at McClarty by putting the rock revetment in. We also have numerous seawalls throughout the county. This particular one is in Vero Spires area, Sector 5. It also has some tow scour in front of the seawall, which is commonly used in some instances to try to dissipate some more of the energy. We also have a large continuous, about 2,000 feet of seawall in our Sector 3 area, Summer Place. Another type of coastal engineering shoreline armoring that's been used in the past and also in the county are sand-filled geotextile tubes. We have several of them throughout the county, in front of seawalls, in front of, in this picture in the upper left, Ocean Gate. Those are more relic, smaller types. And we have in front of Caledon Shores, we actually have a series of these sand-filled containers stacked on each other to protect the dune. And this photo, just to show you, this is right after Hurricane Francis and Jean, and you see that the dune is still kind of maintained by this artificial structure. The county also underwent some temporary armoring. We had, in this case, Bay Tree area, Sea Oaks area also used this, but a sand fence system, which are essentially groin systems where they try to trap some sand along the vegetated dune area, in this case, escarpment area. But they are kind of cumbersome, and they do potentially affect sea turtle nesting, and we did remove them prior to a dune fill project in 2004 in this area. So that lower right photo shows us removing those structures that the subdivisions put in and so forth. And finally, another structure that we have is a segmented submerged breakwater system, which a lot of us are familiar with in this room, our Peppery, just outside the Vero Beach city limits, right offshore. And it's a series of breakwater systems that were designed to attenuate and trip the waves coming on shore. This most recent photo, 2011, lower right photo, just shows you what the system looks like right now. There's some sand in the lee side of the structure, and some growth on it. So with that, if there's any questions, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Mr. Walther to discuss the other various types of offshore coastal structures. Thank you. Screen on the computer, sorry. A lot of graphics. I think it's running slow. Sorry about that.
Thank you, James. Good afternoon. As James said, I'm Michael Walter. I'm president of Coastal Headquarters here in Vero Beach. We have offices in Sarasota, Melbourne, and also in Texas. And this afternoon I'm going to give you some perspective as to the state of Florida's experience with coastal structures. And James talked about seawalls and revetments. I'm not going to talk about those kinds of structures, since those kinds of structures typically aren't used in concert with beach nourishment to improve the performance of beach fill. But I'll talk about some other kind of structures, notably, as James mentioned, groins and breakwaters. And there's been a lot of press in the last 10 years in particular, and much before that, about the potential use of structures. And it's a very controversial issue. There are advantages and disadvantages, as James already touched upon. There's this effect upon the downdrift beaches that is expected with the use of the structure that is really one of the keys at the heart of the controversy, besides other environmental issues, which I'll touch upon. But to give you that sense of perspective, I'm going to start with an overall view as highlights of Florida law that guide beach management and potential use of structures. Talk about some of the theory behind the use of structures that have been documented by a host of prior investigators. Look at some real examples and then offer some conclusions. And I'll tell you right now that the experience that I see in Florida, that we have had in Florida, points to the potential use of structures, notably short groins, to treat hotspot areas where a beach cannot be maintained by beach fill. That appears to be the direction that state policies and federal policies appear to be embracing the potential use of structures. Now, to enlighten you, first of all, let's consider the beach management program. And this program is authorized by the legislative intent. It goes back to 1972 in the Chapter 161 of Florida statutes. And as James mentioned, the primary emphasis of the Florida's beach management program is put sand on the beach. This is the one mechanism that the state and federal government primarily use sand as a means of beach management, because they have found that sand helps everybody. It helps the property or the beaches where sand is placed, but as that sand spreads throughout the system, it benefits the adjoining beaches. And so the state very much emphasizes sand placement and beach nourishment and restoration as the primary focus of the state's program. Now, the state does allow for cost sharing for beach nourishment, of course, when there's state money available, but it also allows for other methods of erosion control. And the statutes point to activities that are ineligible for state cost sharing. It limits hard structures, such as breakwaters, except where they can be designed for erosion control or to enhance beach nourishment project longevity or bypassing performance. It's not the only criteria. That's a somewhat broad scope, but that reflects the state's intent to emphasize beach nourishment as the primary means of beach management and embrace other policies. Now, the state's policies relative to structures are reflected, first of all, in the statutes relative to state's policies relative to inlets. Whereas the state statute requires that on an annual basis, an inlet has to put a similar quantity of sand on the beach downdrift of the inlet, comparable to what would move along the shoreline if the inlet wasn't there, because the inlets trap sand. And fortunately, Sebastian Inlet has done a very good job of this. The continued nourishment of the beaches in Sector 1 and 2 should benefit all of Indian River County beaches. But the state policy recognizes that inlets are a necessary element of our overall infrastructure, but require that the entity mitigate those adverse impacts of those structures associated with inlet by placing sand on the beach. Under DEP's administrative rules, there's also a criteria for the issuance of a permit for any kind of structure, any kind of activity. That structure, it can't increase the rate of erosion, and it can't render the coastal system unstable or vulnerable to the effects of coastal storms. And those become pertinent as we look at structural alternatives. We have to demonstrate compliance with these provisions in order to be able to obtain permits and potentially obtain funding. Comparably, under the state's, the Florida administrative rules, there are provisions that require where structures are expected to interfere with the natural longshore transport of sand along the beach, that those rules require mitigation. And that mitigation Typically, and other examples, other permits that have been issued in the state require the placing of sand on the beaches south of and downdrift of a structure to mitigate those potential adverse effects. Now again, I'll emphasize that I'm not going to talk about seawalls and revetments. I'm going to focus on breakwaters and groins, which are really the key elements and key tools that have been embraced and espoused throughout the state for purposes of improving the performance of beach fill projects. And a breakwater is essentially a structure that's parallel to the shoreline that is intended, as James alluded to, reduce the wave activity in the lee of the shoreline and provide for some stability of the shoreline in the lee of the shoreline. On the other hand, a groin is a structure that's perpendicular to the shoreline that's intended to trap sand that moves along the beach. And as waves approach the shoreline at an angle, they tend to move sand along the beach. In the Net and Indian River County, sand movement is from north to south. And so these are the two types of structures that I will focus upon as alternatives. Now, relative to theory, you don't need to get too bogged down in all of this definition, but there's a fundamental theory of conservation of mass. We take a piece of beach, and if there's sand coming into that segment of beach and sand going out of that segment of beach, if there's more sand coming in than going out, that beach is going to accrete. It'll build up. On the other hand, if there's less sand going out, the downdrift beach may erode. Comparably, if there's less sand coming in than going out, that beach is going to erode. That's a very fundamental concept. All of the numerical models that are used to predict the performance of structures in beach fill employ these concepts. This is a graphical characterization of how the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Genesis model uses that basic concept of the conservation of mass, determining the transport of sand into and out of each cell, each piece of beach, based on the waves that are expected to reach that beach. And other models developed by the Danes and the Dutch use similar fundamental concepts, but they all point to this very fundamental concept of conservation of mass. So if you look at a breakwater, depending on how much wave energy may pass through, and this figure up at the top up here is the over here is a transmission coefficient. Depending on what size waves, if you have a 0 transmission coefficient, that means no waves get past the breakwater. On the other hand, at a 0.3, 70% of the 3% of the wave heights get across the structure. And so the response in the lee of such a structure is going to depend on how much wave energy it blocks. Now this graphic is from the Corps' documentation of the Genesis model, and it reflects that response again is dependent on the wave transformation. As James noted, if the waves approach at an angle and sand is trapped in the lee of a breakwater, it's going to deprive sand from moving down the beach and cause that beach downdrift to erode. Similarly, if we look at a groin, we anticipate we should go out and put a groin on the beach. Over time, that sand is going to build up on the beach on the north side of the groin and deprive sand from the beach on the downdrift side of the groin. So there's a classic perspective of robbing Peter to pay Paul. Some instances, it's okay. We can tolerate, we can manage it, but we have to recognize that these are the effects that we expect to occur. Now, over time, we can see that we might expect a groin to eventually fill up with sand and sand start to move around. But based on documented numerical analysis and measurements in the field, it points to that there is potentially along a straight, somewhat uniform segment of shoreline an infinite amount of time before sand transport is restored back to the condition that existed without a structure being there. So there will always be this downdrift effect. Sebastian Inlet is a good example. If you look at over time as to how far north the sand has impounded on the beaches north of the inlet, keeps going further and further north. The same thing is true at Fort Pierce Inlet and other inlets. The data shows this ever-increasing buildup of sand on the north side of these structures. And Sebastian Inlet is a perfect example again. As I pointed to, it's very evident when you look at the aerial photography. We see a significant offset of the shoreline at Sebastian Inlet. And I use this as an example of what structures do. They can hold and maintain a beach, but they also have a downdrift effect on the adjoining properties. Well, let's look at some real examples in Florida. And Fisher Island in Dade County in Miami is one of the earliest examples of structures. This was an isolated structure. It was fronts. It's an island, a private island that is surrounded by government cut then Biscayne Bay. But it has a series of T-head groins that were constructed along the shoreline that have done a superb job of maintaining the beach that was constructed there. Now, in this instance, this is a relatively closed cell. There is no adjoining beach that these structures could adversely affect. So in a closed cell system like Fisher Island, it works very well. It makes sense to do that. Another example is at Fort Zachary Taylor State Park. Again, in the late 80s, early 90s, a series of breakwaters were constructed at Fort Zachary Taylor State Park in order to improve the stability of the shoreline there. But again, we can see that this is a relatively closed cell system, as we have this artificial headland over here at the Navy facilities to the east, and we have the Key West Ship Channel over to the west. So once again, we have a closed system where these structures have done a great job in stabilizing the shoreline. Again, there hasn't been any downdrift beach adverse effects. There's really no downdrift beaches to affect. Now let's begin to look at an open coast example, and this is at Boynton Inlet, South Lake Worth Inlet and Ocean Ridge in Palm Beach County. And in concert with the beach management program there, the county built a series of groins just south of the inlet. They had a very difficult time maintaining the beach in the lee of the Zeb tidal delta that it was reflected by along this yellow line here. But they built these groins along the shoreline, and the discharge pipe from the sand transfer plant, which is right up here on the north side of the inlet, discharges right in here, in between these groins. And the county has done a great job of maintaining the beach in those areas of groins, but actually it's done too good of a job. In fact, these T-head groins have breakwaters on the end of these groins. Basically, it's called a T-head groin. That has had difficulty in maintaining turtle nesting habitat. The county has had to make special provisions to accommodate nesting and hatchling sea turtles so they can escape and get around the rocks. But in addition, as we look to the south, we can see that periodically between nourishment events, the groins hold the sand very well up here by the inlet. But as we look south, we can see there's an accelerated erosion to the south of those groins that's mitigated through the county's periodic beach nourishment program. A long-term example is in Deerfield Beach in southeast Florida, in Broward County, in northern Broward County. In the late 60s and early 70s, the city of Deerfield Beach built a series of groins along the very southern limits of the city beaches. Once again, those groins have done a great job in stabilizing the shoreline in and around Deerfield Beach, but it has created a condition of significant erosion to the south in Hillsborough Beach, which has had to nourish its beaches numerous times, which clearly is a direct effect of the groin field that exists, in part at least, of the direct groin field that exists to the north of Deerfield Beach. We'll look at Palm Beach has some 87, 90 different groin structures, and this is one groin structure. It's we call it the monster groin, in Palm Beach County, the town of Palm Beach, instead of sectors, they have reaches. And this one groin is at the very south end of Reach 5 in Palm Beach County, and there's a rock revetment along the shoreline and a series of groins to the south of this monster groin. But the data shows that there's been significant erosion south of this monster groin. The data also shows that periodically the groin does fill up, and in 2002, late 2002, the groins had filled. The 04 hurricanes came and took out a lot of sand, and so the groins lost that sand, and they seem to refill again. Here is a June 2009 photograph which shows those groins mostly filled again. So it's not a permanent solution with the groin. It does adversely affect the shoreline. And I'll come back to this monster groin as an example of the direction we think that will be implied by that. But here again is the shoreline change data. And we really look at beach projects two ways. We look at how has the shoreline changed over time and how much sand is on the beach, the volume changes. And those two things are key parameters that we classically look at in evaluating and assessing potential project performance and actual performance in association with monitoring. Here is the monster groin, as I alluded to, In the northern end of Reach 7, or at northern end of Reach 6, there's a series of groins in here, and there's a revetment along this reach. But this shoreline in Reach 7 has realized significant erosion even after a 2006 beach nourishment project as a result of the effects of those groins in Reach 5, exacerbated primarily by the monster. Another breakwater example, switching from groins to breakwaters, is the Reddington Shores breakwater that was constructed by the Corps of Engineers in the 80s. And this structure worked very well again. It was a pile of rocks parallel to the shoreline. It's barely evident through here. But that worked so well that the beach retreated out to the shoreline, that they began to see too much downdrift effects. People began to climb on the rocks and fall on the rocks and have difficulties with it. The Corps actually came out and took some rocks out because to make it work less well than it did after they originally constructed it. But this is an example of a breakwater that I'll say it's partially emergent, partially submerged, but has done a reasonably good job with some tweaking as a result of the original performance. Miami Beach in Dade County built a breakwater along 32nd Street. There was a hot spot where they had significant erosion, and they built a series of rock breakwaters parallel to the shoreline, as reflected in this photograph. The shoreline, actually, they worked too well that the shoreline began to migrate out, and actually now these are more like revetments along portions of the shoreline. There's a tombola that has developed in the lee of those structures that worked pretty well. In fact, they've worked so well, this photo on the left shows before the construction of the breakwaters, and you can see there was a hot spot up here in this region on 32nd Street that led to the construction of these breakwaters. Again, they worked so well that the beach accreted here in the lee of those structures, but also to the north of those structures. They got a significant amount of sand accretion, that led to a deprivation of sand to the downrift reaches. Dade County is now contemplating options, including perhaps extending those breakwaters further down the beach in order to offset those downrift impacts. Well, let's consider some submerged structures, and I'll start with a submerged groin field. This is a proprietary product, and a submerged groin field was proposed in Charlotte County, north of Stump Pass, as an experimental project in order to see whether it could work, keep sand out of Stump Pass and not have adverse impacts. And so prior to the installation, this shows the condition of the shoreline. You can see a lot of sand moving into Stump Pass. That was the area where the proprietors proposed to build their installation. After it was installed, after a couple of years of monitoring, it was found that they did a great job of holding the beach where they put the structures. It actually improved the stability of the beach to the north, but once again, we see this downdrift effect where the beach is south, and downdrift of those groins were eroded significantly. In fact, it's in a state park, and ultimately the state park folks concluded that there was significant damage being done to their shoreline, and ultimately the state ordered the removal of those submerged groin structures. Now I'm going to switch to submerged breakwaters, and again I'm going to say that no matter what kind of structure we're talking about, a PEP, reef wall, whatever, they're all some combination of they're either a breakwater or a groin, and they can be emergent and submerged. I don't need to get too detailed here, but there are studies, laboratory studies, and physical model studies that have been conducted that show that where you place the structure relative to the shoreline affects whether it will cause accretion or erosion. If you put it too close to the shoreline, it can actually cause the beach to erode in the lee of the structure. And so in order for it to work, generally the literature points to putting that submerged breakwater about 2 times the distance from the shoreline where the waves break. Well, in Indian River County, they can be pretty far offshore. But that's what the literature points to. So there is quite a bit of literature out there that points to how these things work. And as a real example, I'll use the Vero Beach PEP reef, and this is, James had a much better picture. Mine didn't come out quite that clean, but this is what it looks like. They're typically about 6 feet tall. I think they're about 12 feet at the base each unit, and 12 feet long as I recall. but they're stacked in a series to create a breakwater. And this shows the configuration of the PEP reef that was constructed in Indian River County, I think it was in 1996. And in concert with the formulation and installation of the PEP reef, and it was permitted by the state as an experimental project, there was a north control zone and a south control zone where the beaches were monitored to see, well, let's see how the beaches perform where there is no structure and compare it against where the beach has a structure. And that data is summarized in a report by Adam Priest, who's a FIT grad. This pink shading reflects the data that was collected and analyzed by the Corps of Engineers at the Coastal Hydraulics Lab on behalf of the county. And then the green reflects the data that was reflected and collected and analyzed by Adam Priest and FIT. And for emphasis, the red corresponds to where the PEP reef exists, and the green is to the south, and the blue is to the north. And the data reflects, it's at least for the last 10 years or so, that where the PEP reef was constructed, it's somewhere in between what has happened on the beaches to the north. All three areas have accreted. They've advanced seaward as a result of the background of processes that have occurred. It's interesting to note that the PEP reef settled. It was only 6 feet high, but settled on the order of about 3 feet. There's no question that had a significant impact upon its effectiveness. Similarly, if we look at the volume changes and actually how much sand is on the beach, once again, we see that where the PEP reef was constructed, it's the sand that exists in the beach is about somewhere in between what's to the south and what's to the north. So it points to that the PEP, I would contend, has not had any significant impact to the system based on the experiment that was originally developed. Now, Brevard County has considered and proposed an artificial surfing reef for the multi-purpose of creating a surfing reef to bring in tourists, but also as an erosion control device. And this reef was proposed pretty good distance offshore, over 1,000 feet offshore. That's pretty much all the way out to the wreck here at the Breckenshire off of Hummington Park, about that far offshore. And in concert with that study, the proprietors worked with us and with others to assess the economic and physical viability of that. And there's three model results here that came from the proprietor himself that pointed to, this is under normal wave conditions at the top end. This is the proprietor's proprietary numerical model at that. And under normal wave conditions, it pointed to, well, there might be a little bit of a bump in the salient that would grow in the lee of that artificial reef. Under storm conditions, when the waves are breaking further offshore, the numerical model indicated, well, it actually caused some erosion in the lee of the structure, consistent with the laboratory tests that I alluded earlier. And ultimately, after things returned back to its normal wave conditions, the model indicated that it would, again, build a little bump in the lee of the structure. It was concluded that although a small salient would form under typical wave conditions, ultimately the ASR would not provide any significant beach protection during extreme storm events and actually could cause the beach to erode. Ultimately, Brevard County elected not to pursue that artificial surfing. Another recent example is in Singer Island, and this is just north of Lake Worth Inlet. This is, in fact, pretty much the easternmost point in Florida. It's a very rocky headland shoreline that exists here. And Palm Beach County proposed a series of breakwaters, originally proposed as emergent structures, and then subsequently changed to be proposed as submerged structures. They proposed these emergent structures, but there was resistance on the federal level to the potential impacts to the sea turtles who attempt to nest on this beach. Is one of the highest nesting beaches in Florida, and turtle hatchlings on their return to the ocean, that these reefs might attract predators who would snag the hatchlings and eat them. There are other issues associated with potential downdrift effects, but ultimately the county, after some guidance from the state on the submerged breakwaters, the state concluded that the potential impacts, including the cumulative impacts of the structures in the beach dome system, may not clearly justify a permit. And the state was about to issue a permit with all kinds of provisions that would require the county to remove those structures if, in fact, certain conditions occur. And Palm Beach County elected not to build those. They've actually withdrawn the permit application for those structures. Another example is a reef ball. And a reef ball, I have to put this picture in so you can see what a reef ball looks like. It's another proprietary product. It's basically concrete. It's used, there's a form that is the proprietors sell or lease, and then these units are constructed and they're literally placed on the bottom, and again with the intention of decreasing wave energy in their lead. There is a proposed project that's still on the books. DEP is staged to issue or deny the permit here in the immediate future. The Corps of Engineers has a demonstration program and demonstrating experimental or innovative technology. Proposed 3 segments offshore. I think they may have changed it since this graphic was prepared. But they also did a numerical analysis. They applied the Genesis model. This was applied by the Corps of Engineers and talked about wave transmission coefficients. So it depends on how much, they're not sure how much wave energy is going to be blocked by these reef balls, and so there's some uncertainty as to how the beach would respond. But ultimately they expect, depending on that wave transmission coefficient, coming back to the basic concept of conservation of mass, that the structure would cause some accretion on the beaches to the north and some erosion on the beaches to the south. But ultimately, in the Genesis modeling results itself, in the aggregate, the shoreline is predicted to be in approximately the same position with the beach fill and the breakwater as it would be without the beach fill and the breakwater. And that conclusion, that statement, links very well with the fundamental principle of conservation of mass. Rob, Peter, PayPal, and the net, you really haven't gained anything on an open coast. Very typical. Now, I'm going to lead you to Phipps Ocean Park. That monster groin is at the north up here. This is a potential project that is in the works of being developed and has the benefit of all the prior experience and consultations with state and federal regulatory agencies as to what makes sense and what's feasible. And this graphic, this photo and panel on the left shows Phipps Ocean Park shortly after the beach was nourished in 2006. But because of those groins to the north, a series of storms, etc., there's a longshore transport deficit similar to what occurs south of inlets. As a result of that, the north end of the beach fill has eroded quite a bit, where by 2011 there's a thin layer of sand that exists along the shoreline. And this graphic's a little difficult to decipher, but this is the monster groin up here, and this panel matches here. This is the beach fill that is proposed currently as one of the options we're considering. And there's a couple of small groins that are in here. These don't have a head on them. They don't have a breakwater or a T-head on them. They're very narrow width, very short groins that are proposed primarily to maintain some beach in front of this town park at Phipps Ocean Park after all this fill is expected to erode away due to the longshore transport deficit that exists to the north. And this is a cross-section that shows that groin. Again, there's a lot of fill that is proposed, and again, this is a concept. It has not yet been filed for permit applications, but we've had pre-application design conferences with the agencies, and the indications are that we're on track, and that we should be able to retain some minimal beach width. In this case, we're trying to maintain a minimum of 25-foot beach width. That's just enough for emergency vehicles to get up and down the beach, for people to walk up and down the beach, and that is a path that appears to be viable in the aggregate in terms of the other structures, the limitations and uncertainties. This appears to be the most viable approach. Now, I'm not the first person to study this. These are some conclusions, and I've taken out a lot of the language to give you the highlights. You're certainly welcome to review this. And I'm going to add to this, but basically most of what was found previously in prior studies in reviewing these types of structures remain valid. And that is that structures like at Zachary Taylor, at Fisher Island, where they're at the terminus of a littoral cell or within a closed cell, these things can work pretty well because they don't have any downdrift effects. There aren't any beaches downdrift to be affected. Structures, fields that are pre-filled with sand can be theoretically transparent to the ambient littoral drift. But as I noted, in Palm Beach County, we've seen the storms come along, take out that pre-fill, the groins start to trap sand again, and the downdrift beaches begin to erode again as a result. So it's not a permanent scenario. T-head groins were in great favor for many years as a result of their decreased offset between the beach north and south, or updrift and downdrift of groin. But because of their potential impacts to sea turtles and sea turtle hatchlings, T-head groins are falling out of vogue with the state and federal regulatory agencies. And then finally, this is Kevin Bodge, who noted that within a structural field, a groin field that terminates in a decelerating longshore transport gradient, that's basically, it terminates in an area where the beach is already accreting, are less likely to promote downdrift erosion. In fact, it would likely decrease the accretion, but not cause erosion if it's designed well. But on the other hand, terminal groins, or groin structures that are within an accelerating transport gradient where there is downdrift erosion, they are inherently prone. They're going to cause downdrift effects as a result of the basic fundamental principle of conservation of mass. So I would offer these conclusions. Structures work. There's no question about it. You throw a concrete block in the water, it's going to do something. How well it works, that's another question. As James alluded, this is a quote that resonates with me, that structures don't create sand, they just rearrange sand. And that was first attributed to Bill Carlton, who headed up the state's first Beaches and Shores, Bureau of Beaches and Shores. If a structure works as it is intended, it will deprive sand from the adjacent downdrift beaches. It has to. Sand has to come from somewhere, and it will result in deprivation and erosion of those downdrift beaches. Under state policies, that will require mitigation, which would be in the form of placing additional sand on those downdrift beaches to offset the effects of the structures. Submerged structures are experimental. The Singer Island case, the state did not call it an experimental permit, but every permit provision that they imposed and intended to impose upon the county came right out of the provisions for experimental projects. It was very clear to me that these submerged structures are going to be effectively considered as an experimental project, similar to the experience that the county had with the PEP and Vero Beach and Palm Beach County had with the breakwaters in Singer Island. Ultimately, in terms of the use of structures to stabilize a hotspot along a nourished beach, short groins appear to be the most viable means to maintain a minimum beach. And with that, I thank you.
Any questions for Dr. Walker? Sure.
The PEP reefs were put in place because there was a...
Could you give your name and address so our for our record, please?
Jim Egan with the Marine Resources Council. The PEP reefs were put in place where they were because they were having significant erosion problems before the placement of the PEP reefs. In your presentation, you point out that they don't seem to have been experiencing any significant erosion problems since then, and the beaches downdrift of it has also been experiencing an increase in sand. So how does that conform with your principle that if a reef works, if a breakwater works, it must deprive sand down, down current, downstream? Downdrift, that's the problem.
Well, I'll respond this way. If a structure is placed doesn't work, there's no adverse impact.
But the beaches were suffering serious erosion before the PEP reefs were put in place. Do you think it was just random that they haven't suffered the erosion since then?
No, I don't. My hypothesis is that after the 2004-2005 hurricanes, and even before that, there were a series of storms that eroded sand from Indian River shores, and that sand moved through the system as a pulse of sand into Vero Beach. That's my hypothesis. The data seems to reflect that, as again the beaches all over that study area accreted.
Any other questions? Yes, Ms. Renzi.
Thank you. Renee Renzi, Waverly Place, Vero Beach. How many short groins would Indian River County need to cover all those beach areas?
Well, if in fact you were going to put groins over the entire county, they might end up being placed on the order of perhaps 200 feet apart. But I don't think that the county needs groins everywhere. I would contend that, as I alluded in my presentation, that the appropriate use of these structures is where a beach cannot be satisfactorily maintained just with beach fill. And the county has done a very good job of maintaining many of its beaches with beach fill. Certainly there are areas that are candidates for structures, but I would not propose or contend that the entire county should have structures.
But the beach fill costs millions of dollars, and it gets washed away in the next nor'easter or the next hurricane. How would the cost compare with the short groins?
In essence, coming back to the conservation of mass principle, the studies, our studies and others point to that there's no reduction in cost associated with building structures. You don't save costs because
but they're
you're
more permanent, aren't they? Once they're there for good.
The structure, well, you can take them out too, but the distinction is that because under state policies, the state requires the mitigation of those impacts downrift and to the south. If, in fact, for example, the county were to put groins throughout the entirety of the county, I would expect folks in St. Lucie County would be knocking on your door for you to nourish their beach and likely make a claim for, in essence, an equivalent amount of sand that the county historically has placed on an annual basis on their beaches. So, in theory, it isn't going to result in a reduction in cost. More likely, it'll just help you maintain a beach where you can't currently maintain it with just beach filling.
Thank you.
Mr. Sharman.
Hey, Sharman, Sebastian. And a wise man once said that you learn more from your failures than you do from your successes. Is that correct? And everything that you've discussed here today, I'm not an engineer, obviously. I'm just an observer. I've been here for 35 years. And I've been listening to, we're going to do this study, we're going to do that study, we're going to do another study. And they all end up the same way. We can't control beach erosion. Is that correct?
Well,
in effect, I mean, you cannot really control it.
You're absolutely right. We cannot fully control beach erosion. No matter what we do, there's always a storm that can come along that's bigger than what we've designed for, and so we can't control it, but we can manage it. I would.
Well, in other words, what you're saying is you can't control it, but you can slow it down a little bit.
That's a fair statement.
That's a fair statement, okay. This is my observation. The barrier island over there on the other side of the Indian River was originally a coral reef. And built up and built up and built up until it collected a lot of sand and made an island. What is the problem with building a reef from where we have a problem all the way down to the, what do they call it, the wormy rock reef? Is that what they call it? That we don't have any problem down at that little area. What's the problem with building a reef or all the way down from and emulating Mother Nature by making it out of, we'll say, concrete rubble? What would that do?
The key is, in terms of the context of your question, I would suggest, is that the state will require, by law, that the downdrift effects, the adverse effects downdrift to the south, have to be mitigated. And so you ask, what's the problem? Well, it's not fix it and forget about it. You still have to offset the impacts that the structure causes. Now, beyond that, there's issues of sea turtles that come into play, but in the bigger picture, from the economic picture, if the sea turtle issues could be overcome, I think the key distinction is one of philosophy of whether or not you can hold on to what you have and not worry about your neighbor. Currently, state law doesn't allow it.
In other words, it's a dilemma. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. We're not going to stop.
They won't let us eat the sea turtles either. They're the main benefactor of this beach restoration.
Any other questions from the audience?
Tom Hammond, Vero Beach. When does most of the erosion occur? I understand it's kind of a continual thing, but is it a kind of 80-20 rule where we lose most of it during a bad storm, or is it something that's just occurring gradually every day?
There's a characterization that I've heard many times by coastal engineers that 90% of the transport occurs 10% of the time. You can comparably say that 90% of the erosion occurs 10% of the time. It's during these extreme episodic events. I've been here almost 30 years now. There's the Thanksgiving storm of '84 that created elevated water levels, very strong seas out of the northeast. There's a host of hurricanes that moved up the coast. There's the perfect storm of 1991. It sent enormous swells down along the coast. It's these episodic events that create most of the erosion that occurs. And so it is not a continuous matter. There are days, probably like today, where not a whole lot of sand moving around out there. The seas are pretty calm and flat. The ocean is, and the beach is pretty still.
Any other questions for Mr. Walther? Thank you very much.
Michael, Tuck Farrell. Is there any dissipation of wave energy that you're aware of with the pep reef or these reef balls? I mean, does the energy of the waves and these storm events, is it dissipated, or when it goes to the reef ball and it goes through the system of this pep reef, it has to hit that structure and go through it. Does that help at all?
Well, it does. And fundamentally, it reduces, when it does occur, if the structure is high enough and large enough, it can reduce the wave energy in the lee of the structure. And that can result in some stability or accumulation of sand in the lee of the structure. But it still, again, has that effect, that downdrift that is unavoidable. It might be small, but it'll exist.
Sir?
Scott Cavaniss, Vero Beach, Shark Bait International. I have a comment about the pep reef in particular. With the segments and inshore and offshore sections, I think that was designed to, the purpose of that was to mitigate the downdrift. But also what I've noticed occurring on a day-to-day basis offshore of the pep reef is that there is a sandbar that's being developed because you have the wave hydraulic action coming across in the wave, and it's going out across the bottom, and when it hits the pep reef, it seems to, what's depicted in the picture there, if you can see it, there's like windows in the pep reef segments, and I believe that turbinates the sand and it settles out, and it's actually creating a sandbar offshore of the pep reef, which might have the purpose of helping to mitigate some of that wave action before it hits the beach. Just a comment.
Is anybody else?
Yeah, there you go, Bob. Mark Tripson. I go look at that pep reef about twice a week, and it's working. All the engineers say it's not. Like there's a drain there between the Ocean Grill and the Holiday Inn, and you can watch the sand moving up and down on that drain. And sometimes it's way washed away, sometimes it comes back. So it's doing what it's supposed to do. The sand may disappear for a while, but then it brings it back. It looks to me like they're doing a pretty good job. Irene did the best thing. It brought us more sand than anything here. Was it 3 weeks ago? I think they ought to put them in up there around the inlet to work. South of there, it's Building Beach. They're around, I forget where, down south of Humiston is building pretty good. So, it may not work in a storm event. I don't think anything works in a storm event. Thank you.
Any other comments? Thanks. Next up, I believe, is Dr. Zerillo.
Thank you, Mike. Nice presentation. Makes my job a little easier. What I've done here, I think I was asked to provide kind of an overview of modeling technology and how it can be applied to evaluate some of these structures. And so I'm entitling this hypothetical potential scope of work to analyze, I'm confining myself mostly to submerged shore protection structures in Indian River County, although I can touch on the issues that arise if need be. And this really, let's try to get the sound here, is a checklist. Consider this as a scope of work, of goals, and specific tasks that would need to be done to evaluate the performance of submerged shore protection structures, submerged breakwaters. We can reconfigure them into submerged drawings or even into shore connector drawings. And one of the most important things, I'll just do the general list. You have to assemble all the existing data, collect a little more if you need it, numerical model set up. One of the most important tasks would be model calibration, and then a series of model tests with and without structures, whatever those structures might be. And I'm kind of borrowing, this is somewhat generic, but I'm borrowing heavily from the work that we've been doing for the last 3 or 4 years for the inlet district. We have a coastal processes model there that was continuously working on some of the district problems and evaluating proposed engineering and other kinds of sand management schemes, and it's helped us a lot to understand.
I can't hear you.
Talk louder. Is this on? Yeah. Should be okay? All right, so I'll try it like this. Can you hear me okay? Yes? No?
No.
Yeah, this was on. Okay.
I hear that.
Okay.
Big
You cannot hear me.
Put up your chin there.
All right, I'll try. So, assemble data, topography, one of the most important things in Indian River County, especially in sectors 1, 2, and 3, rock outcrop locations. We need to know what our physical environment is, wave data, water levels, both at the tidal frequency. We also have about 2 or 3 feet of sea level oscillation every year. Everyone's talking about long-term sea level rise. Well, our mean sea level outside the tides is up and down quite a bit on an annual basis because of the flux of the Gulf Stream. Meteorological data, meteorological forcing for the model. Also, a major issue in the county is sediment distribution, both in the longshore and cross-shore directions. We have kind of literally a mixed bag of sediment here. We have some quartz, indigenous sand. We also have a very high carbonate fraction, which tends to dominate some of the course of rainstorms. This needs to be accounted for in any of our analysis. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk a little bit about how to set up a numerical model, what a computational grid is, what it looks like, how do we force or drive the model, and I'll talk a little bit about assigning structures within the model grid. In other words, we'll form a basic model, and then we will modify it a little bit to account for structure placements of various types and configurations. Model calibration, kind of play off our work at Sebastian Inlet, because we've done a lot of calibration of the coastal processes model, calibrate for waves, water level, circulation, morphology. This all needs to fit together to assure us that we're getting an accurate prediction or simulation. And then I'll kind of go through a series of hypothetical model tests, just kind of listing them, cataloging them, traditional structures, artificial reefs, segmented, submerged reefs, offset, etc. We might want to think about structure beach fill combinations. We might want to think about continuous submerged structures, or we might, as in the 32nd Street and 63rd Street breakwaters in Miami, we might want to think about hot spot treatment. I have a couple comments on that. And then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about expected project results, recommendations, and structure design. So this is kind of our generic hypothetical checklist of what you would want to accomplish in a generic way in evaluating coastal shore protection structures of various types. So project area, we're all familiar with this, so you can read the checklist there, but I want to point specifically our mixed sediment sizes. We do have a stabilized inlet. There are inlet bypass requirements, although they are unofficial. We've had a number of fill projects. since 1978, but intensified in the early 2000s. We have a microtidal environment, largely wave dominated but punctuated by tidal influence around the inlet itself. This is again our checklist of data that needs to be assembled and put into any model simulation. We have a lot of data for this area, both in terms of data collected by the county and also by the inlet district. This exemplifies 3 cross-section profiles, R5, R15, and 25, south of the inlet. This area right now, a good portion of it is being surveyed twice a year by multi-beam data, at least down to R15, so we have a lot of resolution in this area. We might want to extend that high resolution, spatial resolution, bottom topography data all the way down to through Sector 3. It's been a great help in managing the inlet district. I think it would be also useful for the county. This kind of goes back to some of the comments and questions that you asked, the physical environment. And if you look at these plots, what they're saying to us is that we have a very strong seasonal signal. Everyone knows this. Everyone this year, you know the waves are big in winter, generally small in summer, unless we have tropical systems. It also manifests itself in calculating sort of the longshore component of wave power. If we add this all up, we have a slight bias towards south-directed net littoral drift on an annual basis. But we have frequent reversals. The modal direction of littoral drift, the most frequently occurring, is from south to north, but the dominant direction is from north to south because it's driven by our nor'easters versus the less frequent cyclones in the summer. And so most years we're going to have that north to south drift. Any model needs to account for this. It needs real data in terms of the wave climate into it to account for this seasonal variability. And if you look at things on a seasonal basis, and this is just showing some shoreline changes between June 09 and January 2010, between the inlet all the way down to R25, it's just showing the offset of the shoreline. That's just one measure of sort of the condition of the beach. We also, if you look into our annual inlet reports, state of the inlet reports, we have this all mapped out in terms of volume of the beach also. But this is a pretty typical signature. Some losses up in the inlet, some gains around here, and kind of a mixed bag down to R25. This is just seasonal, but if you look at this in the longer term, maybe your planning horizon is a little bit longer, it kind of looks like this. And you can see the benefit of some of the beach fill projects down in this area here. This has definitely benefited over the last decade. This is January 2000 to 2010. We have some losses in here. There's kind of a nodal zone, longshore transport reversal, and some of the material placed in this area in the past has drifted to the north and maybe impounded against the south jetty. But certainly with the movement of the north end of the fill project a little further south in the 2007 beach fill project, it acted more like the feeder beach it should be. So you've got a very different view of things, whether you're looking at it on a seasonal basis or at the decadal time scale. If you want more of this kind of information, at least down to R30, just download some of the inlet reports from the Sebastian Inlet website. So if we understand our system, we have enough data to actually put together a model setup. How are we going to do this? What model are we going to choose? And I just happened to pick the coastal modeling system as an example because we're using it at the Inlet District. I've been on the model development team for about 10 years. This is the Army Corps of Engineers Engineering Research and Development Center Coastal and Hydraulics Lab Coastal Modeling System. And the way it works is it's several model components. It has a flow circulation model, it has a wave model, it has a morphological change model, it has a sediment transport model. And these all interact with one another. So we have good coverage of all the physical and geomorphic and geologic processes. Just a side note here, one of the most recent advances in the sediment transport module of CMS is mixed-size sand that you can put into the model to represent things at the benthic boundary. And this is really important for Indian River County because we are not Daytona Beach. We don't have fine-grained white sand. We have mixed sediment sizes all the way from gravel right down to very fine sand. So we can handle that. I mean, certainly that will, and we can distribute that across our model, cross-shore, profile, and longshore. And just so happens we finished up a pretty detailed sampling of the inlet area down to R30 this past summer, sampling out to water depths of about 30 feet. So we have a lot of information on the sediment distribution to help us formulate to set up a model and represent the real world and better than we previously could. Grid generation, again, I'm borrowing heavily from our work at the Inlet District. This just shows kind of the coverage of our ongoing coastal processes model. You see the inlet kind of in the center, and we go from about R2 188 or something in Brevard County all the way down to R30. In Indian River County, we have a series of numerical observation stations. We, of course, have the tidal inlet itself. We have model boundaries from the north end and the south end in the Indian River Lagoon. I think if you're interested in addressing coastal structures in sectors 1 and 2, you really want the inlet in the calculation. It is a good bypasser. It does bypass a lot of sand, maybe 80% of what comes in from north to south on an annual basis, and we want to make sure we capture that kind of in the north end of our model. Also, we want well represented in any model simulation will be the hard bottom, the rock reefs distributed down through North Indian River County. And it turns out from our analysis with this inlet district, monitoring the shoreline, monitoring the movement of beach fills over the last 8 or 9 years, that the reef morphology plays an important role in funneling, distributing, and influencing the distribution of beach fill sediments and natural sediments. And again, these have to be well represented in any model calculation. One of the features of the coastal modeling system is that you can tag individual computational cells as non-erosional, as hard bottom, or you can put a little bit of sand on top of it that will erode down to where you know the elevation of the rock is located. So again, kind of just a general way of looking at the model grid. This is what the model actually looks like. Here's the model area, and this is the way the current coastal processes model is set up with a lot of additional resolution around the inlet and also on the upper shore face and the littoral zone. So for any analysis of submerged or other structures in Indian River County, of course, we would extend or shift the model to the south to some degree, but certainly we'd want to have some high resolution cells, good spatial resolution where it's important in the littoral zone where all the sand is moving about. There are other new features to this modeling system where we can get cell sizes down to just a couple of meters and still maintain our computational speed. So this is how the model looks, kind of a graphic representation of the numerics of the model. Boundary conditions are everything. If you have accurate boundary conditions, you're much more likely to get good, accurate predictions out of the model. In a way, we kind of, this just emphasizes the way we deal with the wave regime, because it is, as I said, a wave-dominated environment. We have to be able to represent the waves accurately at the outer boundary of the model, and this is kind of the outer boundary here. And so what we do is we have a much larger regional wave model. We take that out to the edge of the continental shelf. We plug in the so-called Wave Watch 3 forecast data, and we propagate that into the outer boundary of our coastal processes model, and then that helps to create the nearshore high-resolution model. The Wave Watch 3 model is what you look at when you go to the NOAA website and you're asking what are the surfing conditions, what are the wave conditions, what is the marine forecast. They're largely relying on Wave Watch 3. However, it kind of breaks down in shallow water, so we use a high-resolution grid in shallow water in the CMS wave model for that purpose, boundary conditions. Hydrodynamic forcing, we want to force with water levels from the ocean, and if we have a model boundary within the lagoon, we want to have lagoon levels as well, and I think it's important to include the inlet in any calculation in North Indian River County. So it would be likely that the model would actually extend into the lagoon to be able to force circulation, tidal circulation around the inlet and distribute the sand as it should be. Of course, our wave, here's a comparison between predicted and model calculations. I'll talk a little bit more about that under a discussion of calibration. So these are the ingredients. The other ingredient, of course, is wind stress. We have a meteorological station, and so we're applying water levels, waves, and wind stress, all as boundary conditions to drive the coastal processes model. And I re-emphasize the fact that we have high-resolution bathymetry, and we also have lots of detail on the sediment size distribution. So all of these ingredients are wrapped up and put into our coastal processes model. Hydrodynamic calibration, just some examples from the Sebastian Inlet coastal processes model. Here I compared predicted and measured water level data. Here predicted and measured wave data, and we certainly capture all of these major wave events. Just as an example, someone, Mike nicely summarized thinking on whether the shore erosion is driven by episodic or storm events, or is it the mean average condition. And certainly we have a number of these cold fronts, nor'easters, and tropical cyclones that come in every year, and you can see that both the predicted and measured wave data is punctuated by a series of events. So, and of course there is a very strong seasonal cycle, and you can see it here, higher waves in the winter, lower waves in the summer, except for these tropical events. So all of this data has to be realistic, it has to be put in the model if you're going to get a good representation of things. Morphologic calibration, of course, is very important. We've been working on this for the last couple of years. Here, show you measured versus model predicted data points on a nearshore profile, R5, 15, and 25, and we get very close to the shore-based profile with the morphological model driven by all of these other forcings. This shows measured and modeled net change, and the points here are from the model. The triangles and the dashed line is from the measured data. In most instances, we're doing pretty well with our match between our predicted and measured changes. It's not perfect everywhere, but I think as, when we put in our mixed size sediments into the model, it's still another boundary condition. This will help us focus this a little bit better. So we're gaining a lot of confidence in our morphological calibration. So if you spin up your coastal processes model and you're gearing up to run some tests on shore protection structures of various types, what are the expected results? Well, I'll talk about the general results first. We want to be able to predict sand transport patterns, both in sort of a morphological and a quantitative way. And here I compare a predicted longshore transport under a low energy versus high energy event, and the color coding here indicates sort of the intensity of the transport. You can see under a moderate wave, 9-second wave, much lower than a 2-meter, 13-second wave. And so under these high energy storm events, whole upper shore face may be out to a depth of 20, 25 feet is mobilized. And the vectors here kind of represent the transport. Again, this is just a model calibration. It's not measured data at this point. Another thing you want to do is look at the littoral transport. I think a lot of people have the idea that there's some number every year of transport north to south or south to north, 200,000, 100,000, whatever it might be. But the model allows you to look at this in a spatial distribution. And here I'm showing predicted net transport over 2 6-month periods during 2009, January to June, July to December. And to try to explain this a little bit, showing the area prediction. And this will be integrating across several numerical recording stations across the shore face from the top of the beach right out to depth of closure at about a little more than 30 feet. And the line, blue line on the south side of the plot indicates north to south transport, kind of a negative value. And so we can see that mostly it's north to south during the winter months. And then we move over to the summer, late fall months. It's from a lot of variability, especially here down around R15 and southward. And so there is a lot of variability in the rate of transport. And I think Mike nicely talked about this when he said, well, the performance of a shore protection structure may depend on whether you're decelerating or accelerating in your littoral transport, and the model will help you understand the spatial variability of that and also allow you to optimally place your shore protection structure. So I think our coastal processes model used to look at littoral transport on a seasonal basis, and the rates here are annualized. And so we have the capability of running it through a season, a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, whatever we need to do. So you need this information in order to think about your structure design. Other thing about expected results, we want to be able to make comparisons between the real world and the model world. And here on the left, I have net measured topographic changes in the 6-month period. And over here on the right, model produced changes for the same period. Kind of focus on this area here between R5 and R15, and we're getting very similar values. And so we're well within an order of magnitude. So I think we've improved the performance of this model over the past few years. You can see that in the cross-shore profiles. You can see that sort of in the global plot here. I also plot the rock reef outcrops. We're continually examining our results on the basis of where are the rock outcrops, how are they influencing the real world, and we want to make sure that we have that influence squarely placed in our model world. So we're continually mapping, remapping the rock reefs, revising our representation of the hard bottom, so-called hard bottom in our coastal processing model. So this is another kind of boundary condition that needs to be wrapped up in here. Also, there's a very nice discussion by Mike on event scale things, expected result. We want to do some event scale simulations, comparing extratropical storm Andrea versus the effects of Hurricane Dean. You can see that in this case, because this is kind of a nor'easter, the transport is on the negative side. It's about 60 hours of simulation, something like that, and it's all directed from north to south. And it's these episodic events through the season, the winter season, that actually provides the dominant littoral drift from north to south. However, in the summer season, we get some waves from an offshore storm. We just had Hurricane Irene, and so we'll be looking at that, effects of that on our model, because this is on the positive side of the scale, means south to north directed transport, but at a much reduced rate compared to Andrea. Andrea was one of those storms that's left a lasting impression on the local morphology. And so I think there's a good intuitive understanding of this among the audience, that these event scale things are very important. Here's just an event scale simulation of, again, expected results. What are the expected topographic changes from a single storm, Andrea, April 2007, kind of flattened out a portion of the Ebb Shoal, this kind of periodic pattern of erosion here along the upper shore face. And I think what was happening is that the storm waves were ripping sand off the top of some of the rock outcrops that were buried, or in the areas between the rock outcrops, and so accentuating that morphology. And this imprint has kind of lasted several years, so we're still dealing with the aftermath of Hurricane Andrea. And the model results here are pretty close to what the measured data indicate. So if we have our model set up, we have all of our appropriate boundary conditions as realistic as they can be, we can start evaluating our structures. And I'm just going to go through an archive, a catalog of the model tests that could be performed. We could be looking at submerged structures. Here are the Sunny Isle submerged breakwaters, way at the north end of the Miami region. They've been in there for some time. You can see a little bit of a buildup behind these structures. You can go on Google Earth and look at this for yourself. Here's another view of them. I think I just downloaded this yesterday. Again, the configuration is a little different, but there's no doubt that these structures have had some influence. Not dramatic, but some influence. They're certainly allowing sediment to pass through to the downdrift beaches, but kind of looks like they're pounding a bit of sand also, helping with the stability. And these are put in as a hotspot treatment. Another thing that we might evaluate, kind of continuous submerged breakwaters. This is kind of a sand-saturated environment. I think this breakwater in its configuration is about 10,000 feet long. This is one of the few submerged breakwater systems I've seen in Europe. This happens to be, where is this? This is somewhere on the east coast of Italy, well north, kind of across from Rome, kind of east central Italy. Another experiment, artificial reef types, so arrange perhaps reef balls into a breakwater configuration. And as, again, Mike so nicely stated, the performance of these things or other types of submerged structures really depends on where you place them. Do you design them for storm waves? Do you design them for average conditions? So there's a lot of detail that you need to work on with the model to optimize the position. This again is the maybe soon to be permitted 63rd Street submerged breakwater built constructed from reef balls. Don't know whether this is going to go in or not. There seems to be a lot of wrangling over that. But again, this is kind of, again, it's an experimental project that's been in the work for some time. Another type of breakwater configuration that you might put in, and these are emergent breakwaters. Again, this is on the Adriatic coast of Italy. I think this is just south of Bari. You can see here that I have a segmented breakwater, not offset, but segmented. This is about 6,000 feet long, segmented. So this would be one of the tests that could be performed with a coastal processes model. Here's another segmented breakwater. This is even farther south in southern Italy. It's sand-starved. You see a little bit, maybe a little bit of sand buildup behind these emergent segmented breakwaters. It's about 4,000 feet long. But you can see, if you look carefully, the beach here is not much of the beach. It's still pretty much armored. But whatever sand is in the system, it seems to be able to, some of it is trapped in the lee of these systems. And arguably, the wave climate in the Adriatic is mild, but these things are designed for storms. Here's another one, emergent breakwater. I don't know the location, but it is somewhere on the east coast, southeast coast of Italy. Again, a good example of, again, about 8,000 or 9,000 feet of emergent breakwater. This one happens to be, looks like they have multiple layers here. It's kind of interesting drawings. Inner breakwater, outer breakwater. You get a lot of layers here, and that's pretty typical for Europe. I've seen this a lot, even in the coastal towns to the west of Rome. They tend to stack these things on. Not sure why they do it, but they do have experience with these kinds of structures. They've been building ports and harbors and structures for 2,000 years. Segmented and offset. Couldn't really find a real example, so well, Pep Reef is a real example. I couldn't find a good photograph, but this is a 3D perspective rendition of the Pep Reef. I think it's about 3,000 feet long. And it's in very, very shallow water, so maybe it's not optimally placed. Here, I don't say expected results or model test, shore connected. This is something you want to stay away from. And this is, again, the 32nd Street shore connected breakwaters in Miami, Dade County. They actually backfilled these. There was no, Ebola did not fill up. They backfilled these and actually connected them to the breakwaters to the shoreline. And of course, as Mike nicely pointed out, they had the downdrift erosion, that sand deficit. I'm not sure why they went for this kind of construction. All they had to do was look at the coast, south coast of Sicily, and segmented shore attached breakwaters with the typical downdrift erosion area. So if they had asked the geomorphologist before they put the Miami breakwaters in, I would say, no, don't do that. You run into trouble. We did a whole report for Miami-Dade, which is eventually passed on to another consultant in trying to remedy that situation. So this is something that's in red, probably want to stay away from. I'd like to bring this in honor of Surfrider and Mike sitting here. Expected results. You might want to consider surf breaks. We've been working on the surf break around Sebastian Inlet for some time. Any structures that you put in, submerged or otherwise, it might be useful to have a look at the influence of surf break. Everyone's kind of familiar with this surf break on the south side, Monster Hole, first and second peaks on the north side. We actually use a Bucinest or a wave resolving, phase resolving model to do this. And I'll come back to kind of a result of this a little bit later on, so I throw this in as one of the potential tests that you might want to perform. So now we finish up with actual examples. This is part of our little project for Miami-Dade back in 2008. The shore connected breakwaters are up here. And in one of our simple model tests, we put in 1, 2, 3 segments of breakwaters, not surface piercing, but somewhat submerged, maybe the top of it a foot or two below the water line. And this shows the reduction of wave energy in the lee of the submerged breakwaters. So an example of a model test. Again, one of the things that you can do with submerged structures or emergent structures is reduce or attenuate wave energy. And so you want to evaluate the wave transmission coefficient on a model basis. Here, again, model test examples. Wave breaking, this is from our phase resolving model around Sebastian Inlet, looking at breakers just to the north side of the North Jetty and over here over Monster Hole. So again, this technology could be applied to evaluate any influence that submerged breakwaters, emergent breakwaters, or other kinds of structures might have in North Indian River County. And it's pretty easy to do and actually a lot of fun to do. It's fun to watch the animations and watch the breakers roll over Monster Hole. I always had this dream of having a real-time model up and running at Sebastian Inlet, doing a 48-hour forecast. They'd be charging $1 or $2 for it. But I think another FIT professor long ago just jumped me on this. So let's do some animations. Just again, this is not necessarily relevant or directly applicable to Indian River County. This is a small project I did 2 or 3 years ago. This is actually the south coast of Nantucket, Massachusetts. And I was asked to evaluate the potential of using portable breakwater segments to construct breakwaters very near shore to help mitigate some shore erosion. If you think you have problems here in Indian River County, you should see what's going on in Nantucket. In Nantucket, you cannot fill the beach, you cannot put up a seawall, you can't build the ground. The best that you can hope for if your house is about to fall into the water is that you could put geotextiles, geotubes, some sandbagging in front of it. And so it's a whole political situation going on there. But anyway, someone came up with the idea of using portable breakwaters and wanted to know if I could help them design placement. And so I'm just going to run the animation. And this is just going to show, I think it's through one storm event, it's going to show the attenuation of wave height in the lee of the breakwater. And this is a segmented breakwater. No, it's a continuous breakwater, and it's about 400 meters long. So it's a pretty big one. And so there we have attenuation. And so the next one, same situation, but zoomed up a little bit, but without the breakwater, but I show the location of the breakwater. In this case, in the model, you can see that there's no wave energy attenuation, and it's reaching closer and closer to the shoreline until it finally is reduced to zero at the shoreline. So these are the kinds of experiments, an example of a series of experiments that would have to be performed in siting, situating any breakwater off of, or other structure off of Indian River County. This is going to look at the magnitude of sand transport. Again, this is our Nantucket case, and this one is a little bit longer. It's going to take a little time to spin up. You see the bluish color will indicate transport, and what you should be seeing as the animation progresses is that there'll be a reduction in the transport rate in the lee of this continuous, about 400 meter long breakwater. Again, as Mike pointed out, you have to consider what the impact of this would be on your downriver beaches. See, this is situated quite far offshore. It's more than 1 kilometer offshore. And of course, they have great sand flats here. You can see some flooding and drying of those sand flats. So the situation here is a little bit different than it is in Indian River County because of these huge sand flats sitting offshore. And so these are quite distant. And so the breaker zone is usually somewhere here, but still this is designed to evaluate what would happen during some of these huge nor'easters that affect this area. And let's do same project, but let's look at predicted topographic change in the lee of offset breakwater, something like the Pep Reef, about 400 meters long. And I think you'll see the impact. You can see some kind of toe erosion or scour around this end of it, but you can also see some accumulation in the lee of the breakwaters as the warmer color. And you saw, I think you saw that in one of the images I showed from southeast Italy. And let's see, finally, we're going to do a line breakwater. Let's segment it. And the result here, again, we're looking at predicted topographic changes at the event scale. And I think if I remember correctly, what you should see is that kind of pattern of sand and pounding on the inside, the landward side, and the breakwater as the animation progresses. I think this might be like a couple of weeks of simulation or so. Again, we get that scour pattern here, kind of at this end of the breakwater, something to be considered. You can see the sand flat building up here, and this is mostly wave-driven transport. I mean, there's a large tidal range here, but we're not near a tidal inlet, and so the vectors here are really showing wave-driven circulation transport. Just run that one more time. So this just shows you some of the capabilities. These aren't necessarily particularly relevant to here in Indian River County, but certainly shows some of the capabilities of the coastal modeling system and other modeling systems of a similar design. I think that's probably my last slide. Question?
Gary, a lot of scouring into these breakwaters. Does it ever tend to affect the actual elevation of the breakwaters?
Well, I think Mike would be a good person to answer that question. The engineers have to design putting the foundation for the breakwater so they're stable. There has to be some scour protection, so that's a matter of engineering design.
Historically, any settlement on the scour ends?
Well, what the example that comes to mind immediately is the PEP reef here in River Beach, which settled quite clearly as a result of the scour that surrounded that structure. But unquestionably, it is an issue. There's a combination of art and science in figuring out how much of a foundation you need. But generally, when we look at structures offshore, we ideally look for a scenario where we have a thin veneer of sand over rock, so we can count on what structure we might place would only settle through that thin veneer on the rock substrate below. That condition doesn't always exist. But absolutely, you're right. It is an issue. It's a design issue that has to be addressed.
And I have one other question. Regulatory requirements to put in breakwaters. What are we looking at nowadays? Can it be permitted?
I would look to the example of Palm Beach County, and I think along the open coast, I would contend it would be very, very difficult to do. There are examples where breakwaters are proposed. There's some that we're working on in Southwest Florida by inlets, adjacent to inlets, but along the open coast, I would say, I'd never say something can't be permitted, but I would say in the aggregate of the experience that I've had and observing others who have pursued those types of structures, I would say it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible.
I can add to that. I looked around the U.S., I looked around Europe, and breakwaters are pretty common. Submerged breakwaters are pretty uncommon. So I think it's just a matter that the technology is fairly new in the U.S. I mean, it's been around for a long time. As Mike said, it's usually associated with ports and harbors. It's fairly unusual to find submerged structures, breakwaters, distal from ports and harbors, although I can point to Sunny Isles, which seems to be successful and somehow that was permitted. And it kind of looks like the reef balls that we permitted for the 63rd Street Beach hotspot in Miami. So I think, in my opinion, it's permittable, especially in today's environment. With the diminished funding for beach renourishment, I think if you do it, and modeling technology is orders of magnitude better than it was when we did that 15 years ago. So I say that it is permittable. Question, Jim.
One other quick caveat, if I may, that in these types of structures that are out of the ordinary, I'll say in general, we would recommend a pre-application consultation with the regulatory agencies. So they're the people who are going to make that decision ultimately. You can learn a lot by speaking with the agencies informally before you set down a path to design and submit a permit application. And it's a very worthwhile step that we have found to be very fruitful and productive for us in the past.
The previous speaker, Mike, has been an outspoken critic of the PEP reef before it was even constructed. In your experience with it, do you believe that the PEP reef was effective? And do you also believe the previous speakers believe that any submerged structure or any structure is going to inevitably have an adverse impact to the downdrift of it? So that's kind of two questions.
I believe that it's been effective to a certain degree. I would have liked it placed in a more optimal position. I would like the crest of it a little bit wider, but certainly it has impounded some sand. And the second question was, what was the second question?
Second question was, do you believe that the previous speakers believe that any structure that's effective will ultimately cause, in a sense, some negative impact, the downdrift of it? Is that an inevitability?
Well, I think the way to look at it is that the structures may have a very short-term impact, but once they equilibrate, once you keep sand passing through it, you impound a certain amount of sand, and if you're working in a pretty sand-saturated area, that adverse impact should go away pretty quickly. That was the idea with the 32nd Street shore-connected breakwaters, and what they hadn't counted on in that place, that instance, was this bypass bar that went around the erosion area. So, if you're very clever, very careful about how you design it, and you don't over-design it, I don't think you're going to cause any downdrift impact. Certainly, the Sunny Isles breakwater looks like it's built in the lee of it as a small tombola or build out. But certainly, that's bypassing sediment. So maybe there's an initial impact. It's kind of like an inlet. You open it up, the ebb shoal builds, becomes a good sand bypasser, and then the effects drop off dramatically. Even Sebastian Inlet, everyone blames it for erosion from here all the way to Miami, but if you look at the facts, over the last 20 years, on the average, the inlet system has impounded only from about 25 to 40,000 yards per year. And that varies seasonally, but if you look at that time scale over the last 5 to 10 years, and I gave this talk at SBPA last year, it peels off about a few tens of thousands of yards of sand, sends the rest to the south. And of course, shore protection structures of a smaller size than a big inlet will have an equally diminished influence.
And wouldn't the model show the effects?
Yes, absolutely, yeah. And that's what it's for. You want to keep running the model, until you understand very well exactly what the effects, the beneficial effects, and the drawbacks. Now we have the capability, because we can run it for a long time. Questions?
Very done up.
No, I was going to ask you a question. I was going to make some statements.
Okay.
So,
Well, if we could ask any more questions, and then we'll go around and maybe put up statements if you want, if that's okay.
okay. Well, I wanted to address some of the stuff that we had seen, that's why. So, whatever.
Okay. Any other questions?
Me again.
Ms. Renzi?
Renee Renzi, Vero Beach. I know that the cost of whatever we do is in the county budget. I, for the first time, asked myself this afternoon, how do the municipalities pay their share of that?
We're willing to address that when we have time to talk. We're willing to get you up to date on where we are once we are.
And a little further on the agenda, we have Jason Brown, who will be discussing that further also. Any other questions for Dr. Zerillo?
Wesley, you have some technical questions on the model, didn't you? Those presentations is why I no longer go to the beaches and shores meetings.
Sorry.
Tom Hammond?
Gary?
Yes, sir.
Have you been able to back test your models? In other words, we know we've seen what's happened, but can you go back in time, and now that we know what's happened, run that model against what in reality has happened to see how closely your model replicates what we know has happened? And how accurate is it?
That's essentially what we're doing now. I say we have an ongoing coastal processes model for the inlet, but we're like a year behind. So we're running 2010 now as we finish up 2011. So it's essentially a hindcast. And so the calibration you saw is against measured conditions. So yes. And so we have a very good idea of how accurate it is.
And so far, are you far enough along to see how accurate it is, or how closely it replicates what reality is?
Yeah, hydrodynamically, it's very accurate. Let's say it's about 85–90% accurate. We are working now trying to quantify the morphology, but every indication is that that is accurate, well within an order of magnitude. So the model is saying you have, I don't know, 500,000 yards of sand that accumulate here. In reality, it might be 6, it might be 400,000. So, it's doing pretty well, amazingly well. I'm, kind of shocked when I see how well it does. You saw the net littoral transport calculations very close to what reality is according to our volumetric changes. So every indication is if you set the model up with accurate physical forcing, accurate sediment, accurate topography, that'll give you a pretty good answer. No, it's not perfect, but you need to know. The other comment I wanted to make is that you essentially need to know the answer in general before you run the model. So if you're running the model, you can see if it's getting off track, because you can get it back on track by making some adjustments. So you have to be savvy about understanding how these structures perform, what kinds of coastal processes are influencing the area, have to understand the influence of storms in order to set up your model to run accurately. I've seen models run with just average conditions, no real water level changes, just eliminating a lot of the real physics. So our mode of operation, our modus operandi, is to put as much real world physics in it as we possibly can. And we work every day to improve on it.
Any other questions for Dr. Zerillo? Mayor Dunlap, would you like to make your comments now or before?
I'd like to make them now.
Please.
I might want to use your board.
Please. You're welcome to use the microphone too.
No, I'll speak loudly. I have to practice. I have to go to chorus rehearsal tonight. So anyway, so I have to have a loud voice. Any of the studies that were done in 1995 and then 2001 by the Corps engineer are negative. And everything they show you on the PEP reefs 5 years, 6 years afterwards were negative. Take a look at the studies that have just been done within the last several years, and they are not negative. Take your eyes and go down and look at the beach. And if you were here in 95 and 96, and you went to Humiston Park, where was the water at high tide? It was all the way under the boardwalk behind the area. Where was the water at the Ocean Grill? It was under the Ocean Grill, and every night you heard beep, beep, beep as they put sand on the beach. Under the Ocean Grill to save the Ocean Grill. How many of you have taken a kayak or swum out and looked at the Peep Reef? If you go out and look at it, you'll see a couple things. First off, and I'm not good at drawing, I'm not claiming I'm good at drawing, and here's land. And I give you that they were put maybe in the wrong place, that they sank down. But you go out and look at them, you see a couple things. You see fish around them, you see turtles around them, and you see aquatic life growing on them. They have coral growing on them. And you go back on the land side, and you look at it, and the sand is building up here. And you look at everywhere on that 3,000 feet from the Twin Towers down to Humiston Park, we see the beach accreting. And what do we see south of it? We see the beach accreting. It actually accreted more than where it did where that was where you put in the reefs. Then let's go back to 2004 where we had Gene and Francis. How many of you went and looked at the properties along the beach, whether it be up in Sector 3 or down further after Gene and Francis? And how many homes were destroyed? And did you have one home destroyed anywhere where we had the Peep Reef? The answer is no. We did not. Did the Peep Reef work exactly? Or PEP? I always mispronounce it. So you have to, I say a lot of things wrong. But anyway, did it not work? No, it appears to have worked. This was supposed to break the waves. What was it, 19%? And I think the model, it shows it only breaks at 5%. But so what? We hadn't planned on building sand up. We've got sand back there. And the mayors have had several meetings on this, and our feeling is this is working. We're not going to have unlimited funds to put sand on the beach every year or every 5 years or multiple years, 8 years, 9 years. We need to do something, and we need to take an approach that looks long term. I'm 68. I plan to be here 25 years from now. I have the genes of my family. I may even be here 30 years from now bothering people. I won't be mayor of Orchid for 30 years.
Folks from Orchid are glad to hear that.
Some of them would like me to leave now. But anyway.
So would your wife like you to leave?
And I don't care whether we tear down all the bridges for 95 when they put new ones in and put cement out there. I don't care if the reef falls. I don't care what they look like, but we need to look long term. And I'm going to start quoting some of the other mayors. I'll just pick on Mayor Adams first. Mayor Adams, at our last Beach and Shores, last mayor's meeting, said, I'm tired of the negative, right? I want you to tell me what you can do positive. And right away, Jim Hill, and he's not here, Don's here, so he's got to defend Jim. He jumped right on and said the same thing. I'm tired of people telling me what doesn't work. I want to know what works. Let's do something for the future. Let's look at long term. And if any of you read the newspaper on Saturday, and assuming Mr. Stevens quoted Mr. Cadden correctly, but he said, if we get some improvement out of it, it's worth it. And at the last meeting, Mayor Kramer, brought pictures showing us the beaches in Vero Beach. And what did we have? Where the reefs were? It got bigger. We didn't have it get smaller. We need to start taking a positive approach here in this county. We need to start looking long term. And to answer your question directly, as mayor said, and this was in the letter that I've sent to the county commissioners and addressed to Mr. Bryan as head of this committee, we're willing to step up to the plate. We stepped up to the plate for Piper. To me, this has more importance for the long term of this county than Piper. Because if you lose the beaches, you lose the tourists, and you lose all the people that come here. And you lose real estate values, and the Barrier Island pays in the high 40% of all the taxes of this county. So if you want to wash that away, go ahead, but that's short-sighted. And, that's where we're coming from. We want to support it 100%. We're not trying to take over the Beach and Shores Committee or the County Commission. We're saying the 5 of us are here to support the county on this endeavor and to put up money if we need to put up money. Now, I haven't heard from Jason, so I don't know how much money we're talking about, and I don't know what they've negotiated with these gentlemen. But I think we need to take a positive approach. And my understanding is Mr. Farrell here has a direct line into Mr. Posey, so we can get Congressman Posey on our side, maybe to get through. And I haven't even met you, but I've had a lot of people tell me you were his major fundraiser and you have his ear, so we can get some support from Congress and get some federal support here. And everything that we had in that original study of the Peak Reef has shown to be positive. The only negative is we didn't get the wave reduction we wanted. So, in a nutshell, that's what I have to say.
Thank you very much.
My other understanding is, take a look at Disney. How many of you would like Disney to leave here and not be in this county? With the jobs, the money it brings in, all the people spending money. That is probably one of the hottest spots, one of the worst spots in the county that we have for water damage and erosion. It's kind of the dump of Indian River County. If you go out there and look in the water, what comes in? Stuff that's thrown off ships. It comes into that area. If your study is right, it's going to show the hot spots. We don't have to put a reef everywhere. We could have portable reefs even that just go in and solve the hot spots temporarily, or they may end up being permanent. And I think that's some of the approach we should take. But that's what a model has to tell us. where to put them, where not to put them. We don't want the negative effect downstream, and our recommendations as the mayor's was to look at the 11 miles going north from the Twin Towers, and it ends right about Gloria Stefan's estate. North of that, you have sections 1 and 2, and the Sebastian Inlet's putting the sand in there. So let's take a look and model this area to start with as the hottest area in the county, and then determine where you go from there. And that's what we wanted to support. We wanted to support a study being done to see what we can do to solve this problem long term. I'm done now. Thank you.
Anybody else want to make any comments before we move on to funding?
My understanding is we all got a college credit from what we listened to tonight. I want Wesley.
Wesley got 2 credits because of where it came from.
There's one, Wesley.
Mr. Brown, why don't you guys come on up and give us your part of the agenda, please.
Thank you, Commissioner Solari. Can everyone hear me? Or
We'll use it so you don't get yelled at.
Hold it close. I'll try and be brief as I know it's getting later. Just wanted to basically get an overall summary of the county's beach preservation funding infrastructure overall. We basically fund beach renourishment through a variety of sources. Starting with the local funding source, we levy 4 cents a local option tourist tax here within the county. 1.5 cents of that is dedicated to beach renourishment, goes straight into the beach restoration fund to be used for beach renourishment. That provides about $500,000 per year. I think we're about $520,000 for this year. Also, that is augmented by the 1 cent sales tax. The county puts forth a substantial amount of 1 cent sales tax has over the prior years. I think we're a little bit under $10 million over the last 10 years, about $9.7 million over the last 10 years. That is the unincorporated area portion of the 1 cent sales tax. Also, I've included here, although it's technically an intergovernmental grant, I've included Sebastian Taxing District as a local funding source, as they did provide $4.68 million, I think, for Sector 3, which was very important for the completion of that project, especially with the lack of state grants so far on there. The other sources, we've got state grants. In the past, we've been able to receive substantial amount of grant funding on some of the sectors. Sectors 1 and 2, the first time around, we've got about 73% and change in state funding. However, I did mention Sector 3. We thought we might be able to get 50%. We were eligible for up to 50% funding. However, due to lack of allocations at the state level, that project has not been awarded yet. We continue to apply for that retroactively after it's been constructed, or mostly constructed so far. But staff wonders about future allocations, particularly with the state of the economy and the state's own budgetary issues. We don't know how much we can count on those state grants in the near future, at least, and then the federal funding, typically through the Army Corps of Engineers. Every 10 years, the county has adopted a beach preservation plan. We did one in 1998, followed up with the next one in 2008. So the next one would technically be due in 2018. It included a 10-year funding plan. The total estimated expenses over that time were about $55 million. We did estimate $34 million in state grants based on the funding formulas for the state grant programs. That was about $34 million. As a note in there, included is the Sebastian Inlet $4.6 million that we were anticipating. So that would require $21 million of change over the next 10 years. If you look, part of that $34 million was an estimated $11 million in state funding for Sector 3 that has not materialized so far.
Let me interrupt you while this slide's still up here. Assuming that the state no longer gives us any grants, which has been the case for the last couple of years, at the end of the Sector 3 project, how much, if any, money will we have reserved for beach renourishment?
We'll have a substantial shortfall. Basically, we've had a couple good things happen. Sector 3 cost less than was planned in the 2008. I think we were looking at about $21.5 million there. With the Upland project, our costs were less, about $15 million, so that helped out. That saved us about $6 million. However, we've lost the $11 million. We were projecting additional funding for the future renourishments in the other sectors. So you can basically look at that. The net of the Sector 3 was a $5 million loss, so that would be added on to the local funding. The next segment was Sector 5, and we included some funding from I think the Army Corps in that, so that would be a standalone, a separate item. But we could lose a couple million more on that if there is no state funding available for that. I think that was estimated about a $5 or $6 million project. Is that right, James? Is that the right ballpark? Okay. So basically, for any state grant funding we lose, that's another local dollar that would be required. And at this point, we are very doubtful on much of that $34 million.
It may help if sometime in the next couple of weeks you can go and give us because what we're talking here from what I'm hearing the mayor say is that we may change the type of program we have going forward. So it may be a good starting point to see how many dollars might reasonably be available given the new economic situation since 2008, so that we match the type of projects going forward with the type of funds we may actually have, or ultimately be able to suggest to the cities how much in additional funds we'd be able to need if we're going to do A, B, and C, which the cities feel we want. And so I think that's a starting point for them.
A rough ballpark would be, of that $34 million, about $25 million would be from those state grants, from the EP grants that we've historically been able to get. So if we've got none of them, the whole would be about $25 million larger than it is. So instead of $21 million, we'd be looking at $46 million.
Jason, hasn't the federal funding disappeared too? Because there was a $95 million cut in the federal budget when they were going through the budget negotiations a number of months ago. It was for beach restoration, and that was one of the things that got axed. So how does that affect the Army Corps of Engineers? Are they part of that federal funding, or is that separate?
Yeah,
the
federal funding is expected to be cut considerably. At the recent FSBPA conference, the Colonel of the Corps, Jacksonville District, did mention that they're expecting $17 million in federal funding throughout the state of Florida, of which I think $10 million or so is actually going to Miami-Dade. So the pool of money is getting smaller and smaller. Originally they had, I believe, about $40 million, $50 million in funding. Yeah, so federal funding is also very limited.
So in short, we're looking at, if we're looking at $21 million a year for 10 years, it's about $2.1 million a year. That's needed on average. If you account for the questionable nature of the state grants, we could be looking at $4+ million a year that we need. Obviously, the tourist tax, as we talked about before, is about $500,000 a year, and our only other real arrow in the quiver right now is the 1 cent sales tax. We were able to get the Sebastian at the $4.6 million previously, but they're fulfilling their obligations through taking care of sectors 1 and 2, which is beneficial. But we definitely have constrained funding in the beach renourishment.
Any questions for Jason?
How much money have we spent in the past 15 years on beach renourishment?
In the past, I took a look over the last 10 years. We spent $59 million. That included sectors 1 and 2 the first time around. It also included a substantial amount of funding for redoing that project after the 2004 hurricanes. We were able to get FEMA funds for renourishing sectors 1 and 2. Also, the portions of sector 3 that have been done, sector 7, a lot of emergency dune restoration, in addition to the sectors 1 and 2 after the 2004 storms.
And part of that money included monies we got from the state and the inlet district and all that, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, the grants actually, because of FEMA and hurricanes and everything else that we went through, about 80% was through grants for our beach program.
Based on what we've been experiencing lately, though, it looks like we're not going to get any state or federal funding for some time. We're sort of on our own.
I think that's probably true. Commissioner Fletcher?
Jason, how much, since the project has started in 2008, have we spent on consulting for sand replenishment?
Since 2008, probably in the ballpark of $3 million. It's a real rough number.
$3 million, and what percentage of the project is completed of the 22.4 linear miles of ocean front?
Well, we're working on the Sector 3 project.
Yes.
We've gone through phases 1 and 2 out of the 3 phases of the project. James could probably tell you how much of
we have
the project that is.
Of restored beaches so far, we have 6.6 miles will be restored for Sector 3, 2.5 for Sectors 1 and 2, and 2 for 7. So we have 5, about a little over half. We have Sector 5 is the only beach that we didn't restore, and that projected is to be about a 2.5 mile beach segment. So we're 80% of our program of restoring. We've done of the projected amount of beaches that we restore. We've done of the 15.7 miles, I'd say 9 miles have been restored, 7 miles.
Jason, how much would you say of the restoration of Sector 3 disappeared with Irene? I'm just saying that because I know when I went to go to the beach after Irene, it was a 6-foot drop-off. Now, we didn't lose, Bill, help me on that, we didn't lose the berm, but we lost...
No, we lost the berm. We didn't lose the dune.
We didn't lose
the
the
dune.
dune, but we lost
totally
all the
intact,
berm.
but we lost the berm. Only on the northern half, though, Richard.
And then if you look at Sanderling, where you have the seawall, there was a berm put there, and that's all gone. All you have is the seawall still. So do you have any idea how much we lost of all that?
Yeah, in absence of the survey, a profile survey, we can't really quantify how much, but probably...
Gut reaction, I'm sure you've been on the beach.
Yeah, yeah, I have seen it. Again, it's been redistributed, so it hasn't been lost.
Yeah, we gave it all to South Beach.
We appreciate it.
It'd be hard to
Thank you very much.
Percentage-wise, I couldn't state right now.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, there has been some losses on the dune, and the berm has been alluded to, redistributed down south.
Over the last month or so, since Irene left, though, we've actually gotten some accretion in Oregon. Some of it's coming back in, not to the extent. We're not going to get our berm back.
And that's typical after a post-storm response. The sand has moved cross-shore and formed in a bar, and then when waves come back on, long period, swells and so forth, pushes it back up. So Mother Nature at work, responding back to the storms. And that's why it's hard to tell really losses, because it's been redistributed throughout the system.
Just real quickly, does anybody know, I mean, given that the sand moves from north to south, is Brevard County doing anything? I mean, that would really exacerbate the situation if they start putting these things in there and we just lost our flow. Are they doing anything up there?
Just Beachville.
Just Beachville.
Well, and to the comment I heard before about sediment accreting north of the inlet, for the last 10 years, there's been a loss of volume in the first 10,000 feet or 20,000 feet north of the inlet. And so things aren't so rosy there either. I mean, long term, with the opening of the inlet, there was some buildup, but there's been some substantial erosion.
Any other questions for Jason Brown? Thank you very much, Jason. Well, now I guess the best thing to do is probably to go around the table and get some comments, and then we'll open it up for the public. Mayor Dunlap, you've probably spoken enough. Mayor Kramer.
I guess so.
I just had one comment. That was on Mr. Dunlap's award-winning drawing up here. He's saying we've got some sand that's going to be built up on the backside of these pep reefs. One comment is, does it affect the shape of our beaches? I mean, does it turn our beaches into these like a dishpan type shape where maybe the tourists might not want to use those beaches if they can't go off into deep water, if the waves don't come in, if they can't surf on them. It's just something to be aware of, that the cross-sectional profile just changes, and all of a sudden they're not usable anymore, the beaches.
Thank you. Any other comments? Mayor Cadden.
Yep, I sure do. I appreciate, number one, I appreciate this comment because I've learned a lot. And what we talked about in the mayor's meetings, I've heard two different things. One, this gentleman today saying it's impossible to get these things through the EPA and whoever else we've got to get them through. Until the technology's changed, it's going to be a piece of cake. Don't worry about getting them regulated. Well, I got to tell you, I'm not going to spend a dime on a study until we do what this gentleman suggested, and that is we go to the agency that's got to license us to do it to say, look, these are our thoughts. What are our chances to get this approved? But I mean, why do an enormous study if in fact you can't get it through Tallahassee? And that concerns me.
Or Washington.
I don't know. Did Washington get involved, James?
It's a layer of government.
We don't have federal. Yeah,
It's permitting comes from the
yes,
state.
but
It's a
not-
berm.
Yeah, it would be permitting.
Okay, but the permitting, I think we've got to explore whether we can permit them or not. I heard a long war story about how we got the original reefs permitted, and it was not an easy task to get them done for this county. And before we spend money on a study that says, boy, we ought to put them here, here, and here, and that's terrific, and then we get turned down and we can't get them permitted, what have we accomplished besides wasting our residents' money?
Thank you. Mayor Adams.
I have a couple comments. In response to Mayor Cadden's comments, I would say they're not going to talk to us about what they are going to permit and what they're not going to permit until we come to them with something to permit.
Well, no, that's not what this gentleman said.
Which gentleman?
He said, Michael said that you ought to take a proposal to them and see what the probability of getting permitted.
But we don't know what we're proposing until we have a study on what would work. And
I would think you could come up with something.
And the second thing I would say is I think everybody remembers the difficulties with the PEP reef permitting process years ago. And I think there's more to that than simply DEP not agreeing with the project and holding it up. There was some other issues involved that played into that. But I would say that we need to do something. We need to move forward, and we can sit here and argue what it is we can and can't do and what we should do and what project is good and what project is bad. But ultimately it comes down to what is our next step? What do we want to do? Do we want to do something, or do we want to just keep arguing about the negative issues of the PEP reef or reef balls or sand pumping or whatnot, and we're just going to stagnate and the beaches are still going to be eroding and the problem is still going to be there? So I would hope that we would come up with some step forward at this meeting and somewhere that we're going, and not just keep meeting for the sake of meeting on beaches and shores. And I don't know what the answer is, but I would hope that the first step would be to do some type of due diligence and some type of study on where the hot spots are, what would need to be addressed with those hot spots. And I think the mayors have already said that we were willing to be partners in that process, whatever that may be. And I don't know if that is, to me, that's the first step, and that's what I would like to see come out of this, is a step forward, not standing still in one place. So here's the concept.
Thank you. Mr. Troxel?
I think she made a lot of sense in what she said, because even if you identify the hot spots and you just pick 2 or 3 of them to go after and see if you can get something permitted and then attack that and then measure and see how it works, we're much further ahead of where we are now, which we're looking at another sand pumping in a few years in Sector 5, and that's going to lead us down the same path we're on now, which is not a long-term solution.
Thank you. Mr. Lindsay?
I also agree with her that we need to move forward, looking at new technologies. And Dr. Gary's slides looking at Italy, I mean, that's the type of thing we need to look at. We're not this was stuff that was going on thousands of years ago. The Romans had to deal with it, right? Was that Roman stuff you were alluding to?
Well, it's actually Etruscans were the coastal engineers.
Well, that was even worse.
They designed the port of Naples.
So there's a way to do this. We just have to think positive, like she's talking, and make it happen. So.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Yeah, we have a plan. we've been implementing the plan over the course of like 15 years. And that is to restore the beaches of Indian River County to the 1974 levels and then maintain sand transport across the Sebastian Inlet, which the Sebastian Inlet tax district is responsible for. We've already identified the hot spots. We know where they are. As far as the Pep Reef working, if the sectors north of the Pep Reef have accreted the same amount of sand, if we got a test section and the spot north of it and the spot south of it have accreted the same amount of sand, you can't say that the test spot worked. We've put over 1 million cubic yards of sand in the system. It's working its way down the beaches. The Pep Reef had nothing to do with it. Now, as far as, I agree with everybody, as far as we need to be looking at technology to maintain the sand on our beaches, because we have issues. But we do have a plan that is working. We just need to figure out how to pay for it, because right now, we obviously don't have the money, and we have Sector 5 to finish. And once I think all of our sectors have been restored to their levels, and the Sebastian Inlet Tax District keeps pulling it up and placing the sand on our beaches, that this system will work naturally like the beach is supposed to work.
Thank you. Mr. White?
I agree with Dave here, exactly. I mean, we have a system in place and it's working its way down, but we just have to add more to it. Wait for new technology, but then again, I'm not so sure that Pep Reef worked that well. I mean, after Hurricane Francis and Jean, that whole boardwalk was undermined and that had to be completely rebuilt by the city. I mean, it looks like it's works at times and other times it's not. So I mean, damned if you do and damned if you don't.
The boardwalk is not where the Pep Reef is. The Pep Reef's going north of the Twin Towers.
Down by Old Krusty's there? That was the...
that one, yeah. That one's there.
Hunston Park by Krusty's.
Yeah.
That was all washed out.
The one north.
Oh no, I'm talking, that's the one I was watching there after the hurricane. But now that's an extraordinary storm situation. You know, is it a one in 100-year storm or something that's going to affect it? But you know, it's a tough situation, no question about it. We have to do something.
Thank you, Commissioner Fletcher.
Thank you. Dr. Walter, Dr. Cirillo, I appreciate the presentation. I tried to intently grasp what you presented in its entirety, but I have to tell you, I might have fell short.
You and Wesley.
I don't know if I'm alone. Maybe Wesley's with me on that too, and he studied.
You get a B+.
But nonetheless, it's not the buildup that I anticipated regarding infrastructure, and that's okay. You gave us a scientific approach. I studied in the science in the ocean as well as part of my misspent youth. I wasn't here in '95, but in '75 I was diving. And I recently visited some of the places that I did. I no longer dive. I got some sense. But nonetheless, the areas in which have infrastructure, whether they be balls or nooks, hooks, jetties, any infrastructure has still withstood the toll of time, and the beaches are in a whole lot better condition. We need something to knock this off, knock it off center, because what we're doing is we're painting the beach every 5 to 10 years, and we're going to be painting the beach again in another 5 to 10 years, and we don't have the money. What could you say that this proves that the infrastructure from Maine to the Keys has worked? I heard a comment that said that you said that, well, if it works, it's good, but you know, whether it's going to draw or detract was, well, if it happens, it's good. Isn't there anything more concrete in why these other jurisdictions were able to place these infrastructure devices and they've proven themselves? No?
Well, I would say every project's different. In my review of these projects, some of them reflect similar experience that the county had with the BCC reef. There is discretion at the end of the day, and depending on the information that's submitted with the applications, the state and federal agencies make a decision. Every application I've ever looked at, there's different sets of data that is presented. So there is no hard and fast rule in the regulatory arena as to what is and is not acceptable. It's a gray area. And that's why we see some of these things that are permitted, that are as an experiment, and other things that, by virtue of the criteria that the state has imposed, for example, the Singer Island project in Palm Beach County withdrew the application. So it's very site-specific, very community-specific as to what your goals and objectives are, and what risk you're willing to accept in terms of mitigation, in terms of modifications that may be required by the agencies.
But notwithstanding a study, isn't there any way that we can propose a model, a minimal model? It's something that may not have the scientific coefficients to be presented to the government, but at least some assessment of what type of structures would be suggested here in Indian River County? I mean, again, they are working elsewhere.
There's nothing to preclude the county from taking those steps. And certainly the agencies will become involved when you begin to actually make a proposal and file a permit application.
And it could be done at a minimal cost.
I would expect it could be done at a reasonable cost.
I guess I have a feeling that you're going to see more and more applications for these kinds of structures over the next decade because state funding for beach bills down. So people now are reaching out for alternatives. So I think the DEP is going to get a flood of applications. So they're going to have a system by which they sort through these things and permit some of them. I know 3 or 4 other counties are thinking along your lines right now. That we have to do something other, or at least in combination with beach renourishment. I think you're seeing a lot of that along the East Coast and some counties along the West Coast. I think coastal structures are pretty new in Florida. You go up to New Jersey, they're all over the place. They don't have a problem permitting them. So
You mentioned it, I didn't, but they're all up and down the coast. I mean, I've seen all the variants too.
Yeah.
Commissioner Davis.
Yeah, we got.
I think that the one thing that I don't have resolved in my mind is the issue about whether or not the PEP reef worked. I mean, we've got empirical data that you go out there, we hear from, don't take it wrong, Mark, but old timers that say yes. I mean, we've seen what this has been like in the past, and yet you bring a good point. Does the beach to the north and to the south look any different? So I understand, and that my mind is going around in circles with that because I don't know whether or not it works. And we want to study something. I'd really like to see exactly what the hydrology was there. If it is working, if it's better than what it was. I don't like to use the example of the 2004 hurricane. I think that doesn't do any beach justice to throw an extreme event in there on it. I think that the time right now that we're having, which is I would say rather average, we have northeasters occasionally. We have a strong front come through. We have a tropical storm or a hurricane, glance. Those are the kind of things that, does the PEP reef, does it actually hold and retain sand there so that whenever we do have regular events that it builds the beaches or something? I don't know. But that's where I'd be in favor of doing some research and seeing, okay, and the best way everybody says about getting one permitted or moving forward with it is going to be to prove that in fact it does work.
Commissioner Wheeler.
There's a study, excuse me, Mark Tripson, there's a study from FIT that says it works. It's what one of the graduate students came out in 2008 or 9.
It's on page 109 and 110 of the study.
So that's working, wasn't it?
Which paragraph was that, Mayor?
Yeah.
In your case, you need to read both pages.
Well, then what is it then? Okay, so if we're going to go based on the assumption that it does work, but I just heard a presentation by somebody that said it didn't work.
Yeah.
I mean, we've somehow maybe either not the graduate student or I don't know. I mean, we need to get that question answered because that's going to be the easiest way to move this whole thing off center, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think if I could just add one thing with the PEP brief. The PEP brief had certain design criteria established with it. And the success of the PEP brief was based on evaluating that design criteria. So was it effective at attenuating waves? Was it criteria? No. It didn't attenuate waves because it settled so much. However, it is doing something in the system not as originally designed, and it's perching the beach. It's actually sand's being retained on the leeward side of this structure, and it's bringing sand up onto the beach. We've also done beach fill projects in the past and so forth that, you know, some of that sand is still retaining in the system. So from a design aspect, that's why, you know, the Corps of Engineers studies and so forth said that it did not work.
Well, that's kind of where I'm going. Not necessarily from a design standpoint, but in a practicality standpoint, is it working?
Yeah.
And if that's the case, I mean, we see that, but that's what I'm hearing you say that the study didn't address. And so it's kind of like, are you going to believe the study or your lying eyes? I mean, which one is it? You can go out there and look at it, and if it is working, then figure out why it's working, because we'll want to know that in advance of putting another one in if we do.
It's performing it at different...
Improve upon its design so it doesn't settle like it did.
We don't... I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, but I mean, maybe we don't need to. Maybe the design is make it 6 foot so it sinks 3 foot, and I mean, I don't know.
Or maybe the pep reef isn't what we end up going with.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, it could be that you need something to look like what the pep reef is now. Peat reef or whatever.
There's so many different periods.
That's us.
Commissioner Wheeler?
Yeah, I don't, the pep reef may be doing something, but are you getting a value received for money spent for what it is doing? I've been involved to some degree or another with this for about 25 years. When I was first on the commission, I was chairman of that committee when they chaired them. I've been to the beach and shores things, and I got to tell you, what I'm hearing today is what I've been hearing for 25 years. There's no solid solution. But I do, common sense to me anyway, and I'd love somebody to tell me why it couldn't happen. We put all the sand on the north beach and it drifts to the south beach. And down south, around Castaway and like that beach is a few hundred feet further out or more than it was 20 years ago. And it would seem that it would be more practical and cost efficient to go down and take sand off that beach and transport it to the north beach and keep moving it back and forth. It's exactly what I got last time I brought this up, I was laughing. But the bottom line is that sand was put there to move south. They got more beach there than they need. They don't have an erosion problem. They aren't losing buildings, etc. And that's what's happening north. And you'd have less trucking. It's cheaper than pumping sand. And I know you'd have to go through the legislature and everything else, but at least it's something. If we're going to keep redoing this beach periodically, it would save some money to do that. And I don't know why we don't. I mean, the sand came from the north to the south, and they have much more sand down there than they need. And the dangerous part of the hot spots in the areas where there is no beach, and you lose buildings, and then they put seawalls in, and that saves the buildings, but it destroys the beach even more in a more serious storm. So you're just creating a bigger and bigger problem, and it just keeps getting larger, and we keep dumping money on the beach. But we ought to find the most efficient way we can to dump that money on the beach. And if we could borrow that sand, because they're borrowing it from the north, if we could borrow it and take it back to the north, just like when they transfer the sand from the inlet over. And I don't know why they can't do it.
How would you get it there?
I'd love to have somebody tell me what's the, other than the bureaucracy, does that thought hold water, or is it just stupid?
Well, Miami-Dade actually did that. They backpassed sand from Miami Harbor back to that erosional hotspot that was south of 32nd Street, the breakwaters. They did it as a stopgap measure in 2007. They just trucked it off. So there's precedent. It wasn't very far, but it has been done.
There's another example in Southwest Florida, in Treasure Island and Pinellas County. There's a similar program is proposed, and it's contingent upon storm events that require the need to bring sand from where it's accumulating. There's a huge wide beach, or alluded to where it's needed. So there is precedence for.
Well, I wonder why we don't look at that. I mean, it's an interim solution, but everything we do is an interim solution. It doesn't last. There's no, I've argued with myself over this for years, and we have to replace paving on roads. We have to replace roofs on buildings. I mean, everything has a life cycle. This just has probably a little shorter life cycle and costs a lot more to fix. But, as long as we've got to do it, we ought to try and find the most efficient way to do it. And I don't think we've ever looked at it in this county. I'd be interested in looking at it and see if there's any validity to it or not.
Commissioner O'Brien.
Do away with the permitting process here.
Yeah, we do away with the government would be great.
Well, I hauled $20,000 worth of sand on a piece of property 3 years ago. And the permitting and engineering was $45,000 for $20,000 worth of dirt.
Well, we had a $300 diesel spill, and the mediation was about $5,000, and the monitoring has been about $25,000, and has not ended yet. So we all understand what bureaucracy does, but we're not.
It employs a lot of people.
It does. Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Mayor Adams that the permitting agencies aren't going to tell us anything definitive until you show them the actual plan. They're not going to commit to anything unless it's in writing. The state's tough enough, but keep in mind we still have to go through Army Corps, the Fish and Wildlife, the turtle folks, and no one's going to give you the okay to do anything until you got it all down in writing. And we won't know what we're proposing until we do the modeling to find out what we think has the best chance of working. And then when we go to the agencies, we can say, the model says there won't be negative impacts, and then we can maybe get somewhere. So I would be all in favor of moving forward with the task force to further define the scope of the model. One of the things I'd like to include in that is looking at the Riamar South Beach area, because the South Beach there in the city, as long as I can remember going back to '84, that beach has always been pretty stable. And I know that right there at Riamar, there's a couple of nearshore reefs that they kind of angle in from a southeast to northwest angle, but the inshore reef almost comes up to the beach, and at low tide, a lot of times it's exposed. So obviously something's working there, and I think we ought to factor that into the model and try to get an idea, okay, well, what's working, and then maybe we can duplicate that. And I think David was very pretty much right on the money. We've been implementing our plan, and I think we're close enough to go from the one phase just to restore the beaches, and we did 7, we did 1 and 2, we're doing 3. David, I don't think we'll ever get to do 5. I think there's just too many issues there with the referendum and all that. But right now, I think it's probably in fairly good shape. And the other idea would be to go is, well, what if we can establish the feeder beach program, which is our next step, once we've restored these beaches back up, and somewhere near the south end of Sector 2, north end of Sector 3, James, I don't know, but if we could permanently establish a feeder beach program where every year we'll move 50,000 cubic yards into that feeder beach and let it start drifting south. And now that we've got these other sectors built back up and working with the Sebastian Inlet District folks and their transfer programs, to me that seems the best way to go. And then we tell the permitting agencies, listen, we're going to get a permit one time for a 20-year feeder beach, and we're not going to do all these studies and millions of dollars of monitoring. We're going to just say we're putting the sand back in the system and letting it work its way south naturally. And if some of that sand covers up a hard rock bottom here, well then naturally that was going to happen. We're just putting the sand back in the system that is not getting by. So, and to me, if we, and I'm just picking a number, 50,000 cubic yards, that we may need more or less, but even if we're paying $15.66 a cubic yard now for actual placement of sand on the beach, that's to mine it, sort it, test it, haul it, scrape it, put it on the beach, ready to go. Let's just say in the future it's $20 a yard. That's only $1 million a year. Now I know that is a lot of money, but tourist tax is $500,000 a year that's going to this. And to me, that becomes a fairly cost-effective way of putting sand on the beach and getting it back in the system on a regular routine basis. So I would like to look at that. And then the other thing is we're always talking about how can we stop the movement of the sand from north to south. And I don't know, Gary or Mike, is there anything we can do to help help push it more south to north? Can we put something in that might refract an eastbound wave and make it southeast so it pushes sand in. Just an idea to look is, instead of trying to block the north to south, is there any way we can enhance the south to north movement? So I think that might be another way to skin this cat. But I do think we need to move forward, at least with some type of task force, maybe a couple members of the beach committee, one or two mayors and a commissioner, and sit down and maybe the other stakeholders and come down with a more tighter scope of services, exactly what we need for this model, how far we want it to cover, what areas to look at, and then come back and sit down and with the mayors and say, here's the budget for it. How can we do to make this thing happen?
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman.
Well, all I know is that if my Roman predecessors can manage beach renourishment, that we can do that in America today. And I'm not really, this is my first time listening to this type of conversation, so I'm not going to add much more to it. I think, just reiterate a couple of things that have been said. One is that given the state and federal cutbacks in funding, I think we need to revisit that and just check where that is and see exactly where we are with funding. Just ask Commissioner O'Brien if we need a task force, or the things that you mentioned, can we just charge the Beach and Shores Committee to look at? It seems to me that that's, in my mind, what they're set up for. I don't know.
Yeah, possibly. I think at least the one or two of the mayors might like to be involved in that.
And
this would be my
two mayors on the ocean.
And then you can certainly ask them, I just seems to me that'd be the easiest way. Other than that,
he's all fixed up. He's got all the pet reef he needs, right?
I think the most important thing is, from what I hear from other commissioners, is that we basically have a commitment to the beach, and we are certainly going to go forward. And I think it's up to us to ask our staff to try to start looking in continuously for the best paths forward, and to take into account some of the things everybody has said today. So with that, I'll open it up to the public. Anybody from the public wish to make some comments? Jim?
Jimmy with the Marine Resources Council. I got involved looking at your PEP reef because I was tasked by the town of Jupiter Island, who's doing the same thing you guys are doing. They're south of an inlet, and they're constantly fighting this battle. And the thing that made the battle really problematic is this cutting down of state and federal funds. And so it's really brought this issue to the head. And as I started looking at the science, what I realized was that a lot of our state science and a lot of our consultants basically were part of the process. They were making money through the process of pumping sand and putting it on the beaches, and it was a renewing source of funds. So they had a vested interest in not looking at alternatives. So Florida is behind the times in terms of not looking at alternatives. And the PEP reef, for all of its poor placement, has worked for 15 years. These areas had less effect during the 2004 storms, where you guys were like getting some of the worst impacts going, and recovered faster. And at a relatively small amount of investment, and it's not failing now. It's still showing positive results right now. So not to say that PEP reefs are the solution, just simply even things that didn't work exactly as they wanted to, do work. We know natural reef systems are fabulous at protecting beaches. All we're doing is reinventing what nature has been doing for hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years. So opportunities are out there. I think what's important is, what I'm hearing here is that you want to do the science. If you do the science, you look at all the alternatives. No structures, just sand pumping. Doing nothing. Trying all the structures that are out there, then you'll get, for a couple $100,000, an assessment of all the strategies that will cost you millions, and what is the long-term solution. How far? If you do just sand pumping, how many years before you're likely to see that sand go away? If you did a structure, how many years before that sand is going to build up or not build up? And so when you look at all these options, if you have a model, you'll be able to evaluate both what's available today. If somebody comes up with new technology 3 years from now, your model will work for that. You'll be able to evaluate things that we don't even have right now. So having the science behind you, with the small cost of the science, you'll be able to make those big decisions in a much safer way.
Thank you. Anybody else from the public?
Yes, Mark Tripson. You got every politico in the county here in this room. Get a hold of the governor and the Army Corps of Engineers, have them come down here and that we need some money to help on our beaches. What can you do? I mean,
Don't say nothing.
Well, they can say nothing, but you got the opportunity to call and bring them here. I mean, Scott says he wants to help fix the beaches. So if he said that, let's see if he's telling us the truth or not. The Army Corps says they want to do the beaches. So call them up and see if they'll come give you some money to do it. I don't know how much you need. A lot more than you think, probably.
Well, we had an estimation of, in Mr. Brown's report, of about $25 million that they're going to be possibly not giving us, so we can start with that.
Chicken feed, according to the state of Florida.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
So then, is the consensus that we're going to have a task force or subcommittee of the beaches and shores that's going to include some of the mayors to help address their concerns? Is that ultimately where this needs to wind up?
Well, there's not a mayor on Beach and Shore right now, is there?
Yeah. No.
Okay. So
why don't you just get, but Richard is really into this, and I am too. So I think we ought to be on that task force. And we're not on Beach and Shore, we're getting to it.
Well, to kind of keep this maybe simpler from a sunshine and minutes and all that, it might be easy to task the Beach and Shore with working with staff and other interested parties to come up to further define the scope of service. And then maybe you all for your town, if you just come to the meetings or just, Mayor and Cavaliers place, maybe you could just be the representative on Beach and Shores too. You guys could do that from a town point of view.
Well, I can't do that because the other councilman is on Beach and Shores. Our Beach and Shores representative is a councilman.
Okay.
And our alternate is another
And
councilman.
so is ours right
So that
there.
does get us into
So
sunshine.
unless it's a public meeting, Bill and I can't be in the same meeting together.
Well, they are public
Within
meetings.
the Beach and Shores would be public meetings, and y'all could just come in and be part of the
We could
discussion.
be part of the crowd, but not voters probably, and that could, and I'm saying this, your lawyer probably should put in on that so that there's not a conflict seen there, because if we commit money, we really have to commit it by each of us, by going back to our councils, of which we're one of the 5 votes. And so it doesn't look like we've packed with 2 votes, the 5. Right?
No, I don't think the Beach and Shore would commit to any funding. I think they would say, okay, this is exactly what we want the scope of study to do. We could then ask Dr. Zerillo or put it out to bid, see what it comes back, and then we would reconvene again in a situation like this and say, okay, you all are proposing 10%, 12, 15, 20, and we all agree, okay, that sounds good, then you'd have to take it back to your councils to get them to approve. But the Beach and Shore wouldn't get to the funding part. It'd be more to develop the scope of the...
What we're going to do from this point forth.
What you're going to do, and then I think you as a committee would negotiate who you're going to do it with, put out, a request for proposal, an RFP, and see what you get. If it's reasonable, then come back, and we have to take it back to our councils.
Yep. So I think, Mr. Chairman, just if we task the Beach and Shores Committee to work with staff and other interested parties to further define the scope of a proposed model and let them get to work on it.
Sounds fine with me. This is a workshop, but I think we've got consensus here that staff can take out. Anybody, any final comments from the public?
I just have one more thing. I don't want anybody to think that I'm anti-pet brief by my comment on that. I'm pro-science. I'm more of that. I honestly believe that alternative technologies hold the answer to our problem. But right now, as being a member on the Beach and Shore Committee and knowing the regulatory problems, I don't want us to be spinning our wheels looking at these alternative technologies when we already have a plan in place. That being said, I would very much like to see Dr. Zarilla do some modeling on our beach preservation plan to see if it actually is a viable plan, and then he can factor in the fact that what Peter said, Sector 5 may never get done. So we may have to adjust. We've been adjusting our plan every 10 years, and we may have to adjust the plan again because his modeling may show that our plan may not work and alternative structures are our only source, our only recourse. I mean, you're talking to somebody who's all for ASRs. Artificial surfing areas, I think, are the answer. The state's not going to permit them, and they're deemed to be economically a boondoggle. So But I just don't want anybody to think I'm anti-PEP reef. I just don't think the science was there for everybody to say that the PEP reef worked.
Mr. Chairman?
Same thing for me. I mean, a natural reef always seems to work. Any type of structure out there does help the beach. I mean, that protects the barrier island, some type of natural reef. And if you put an artificial reef in, that's similar to a natural reef. I mean, I like Peter's idea where the natural flow, filter down, just keep renourishing or factoring in that southern area and let it work its way down, as well as putting in some type of reef. It sounds like a logical way that's going to help, but there is no sure answer here, I don't think.
Commissioner O'Brien?
Just if I could ask the board also for consensus, when David talked about our beach preservation plan, if we could direct Jason to look at the beach preservation plan and projections and recalculate the financial model of that under the assumption of zero state and federal funding and where we are. Because I think I agree with the chairman. I think the reality is there's a better chance there's no funding than there will be funding. So I think we need to look at this with zero input under the Fed and state level, and then we can. I think we need that to help update our plan, David, to see, because it's got to be financially feasible as well. And if there's no outside funding, then we got to really take a hard look at what we're doing.
It'll motivate us a whole lot more.
Yeah,
I think that's an essential part of it. You can't go forward.
Is that okay with the commission?
Any other comments? There being none, we will adjourn. Thank you very much, everybody.